The letter arrived on a Thursday morning when the autumn light slanted through the dining room windows of the Mercer house in a way that made the dust motes visible. Elena watched them drift while her father broke the wax seal on the envelope that would change everything, though she didn't know it yet. She was thinking about her grandmother upstairs, about the compress that needed changing, about the medicine that should have been administered 20 minutes ago, but wasn't because her mother had called everyone to breakfast and Elena couldn't be in two places at once. Robert Mercer's face did something strange as he read. His jaw loosened, then tightened, then loosened again, like he was tasting something that started bitter and finished sweet. His wife Martha leaned in, reading over his shoulder, and her hand flew to her mouth in that theatrical way she had perfected over 30 years of pretending to care about other people's troubles. Across the table, Elena's sisters Rebecca and Margaret straightened in their chairs like hunting dogs catching a scent. Elena set down her fork. The eggs had gone cold anyway. "Read it aloud," Martha said, though her eyes were already scanning the page, already seeing whatever it was that made her husband's mouth twitch toward a smile. Robert cleared his throat. The gesture was unnecessary. His voice never needed clearing. He just liked the authority it had suggested. "It's from Nathan Stone, the rancher from Coldwater Valley." Rebecca's eyebrows lifted. At 27, she'd been waiting for a proposal that hadn't come, watching younger women in town marry, while she perfected the art of looking beautiful and saying nothing controversial. "The one who owns half the valley. The one who owns 3/4 of it now," Robert said, and there was something ugly in his pride, as if proximity to wealth could be claimed through mere correspondence. "He's asking for a daughter's hand in marriage." The silence that followed had texture. Elena could feel it pressing against her skin, could taste it in the air between her heartbeats. She knew what came next, had known it all her life, really the way you know a storm is coming before the first drop of rain falls. Her sisters would simper and compete. Her mother would calculate which daughter provided the best alliance, and Elena would be forgotten in the corner as always, which was generally how she preferred it. But then her father's eyes met hers across the table, and something cold slithered down her spine. "He's asking specifically for Elena." The laughter started with Rebecca, a short, sharp sound like a dog's bark, surprised out of her by sheer absurdity. Margaret joined in next, her laugh higher, more sustained, the kind that bent her forward in her chair. Martha's face did something complicated. Shock, then confusion, then a slow spreading delight that looked almost like love, but wasn't, had never been, would never be. Elena's hands stayed folded in her lap. She'd learned years ago not to react, not to give them the satisfaction of seeing her flinch. But inside something was crumbling, the way stone crumbles when water freezes in its cracks over winter. "That's impossible," Rebecca said when she could breathe again. "He's never met her. Has he, Apparently he has." Robert was reading further, his smile growing. "He says he encountered her in Riverside 5 years ago. Says he was impressed by her character and has thought of her since." Margaret wiped her eyes. "Elena's character? You mean her inability to keep her mouth shut? Her habit of embarrassing this family at every possible opportunity? Her tendency to interfere in matters that don't concern her?" Martha added, warming to the theme. "Her complete disregard for proper feminine behavior. Her absolute failure to be what a woman should be." Elena kept her breathing steady. In, out. In, out. She focused on the dust motes again, on their slow drift through the morning light. Somewhere upstairs, her grandmother would be wondering where she was. The compress would be warm, now useless. The medicine would wait. "This is perfect," Robert said, and the word landed like a stone in still water, sending ripples through the room. "Absolutely perfect." Rebecca's laughter had faded to confusion. "Perfect, father, surely you're not seriously considering—" "Considering." Robert set the letter down on the table with the careful precision of a man setting a trap. "My dear Rebecca, I'm accepting immediately. Mr. Stone has offered a generous bride price, more than generous, and he's asked for Elena specifically, which suggests he has no idea what he's actually getting." The pieces fell into place, then each one clicking into position with the inevitability of a lock closing. Elena saw it all in her father's face, in her mother's spreading smile, and her sister's dawning comprehension. They weren't laughing at the absurdity anymore. They were laughing at the revenge. "By the time he discovers what she really is," Martha said, "the marriage will be final. She'll be his problem, not ours." And we'll be rid of her, Margaret added. Finally. Plus the bride price will more than cover the losses from that business with the magistrate. Robert's voice carried the weight of old resentment, the kind that had been aging in darkness for 3 years. Elena cost us a fortune with her meddling. Now she'll pay us back. Elena's nails cut crescents into her palms. The magistrate. She remembered him. Remembered the careful months of gathering evidence, of documenting the bribes, of watching him rule in favor of men who'd paid him while families lost their land. She remembered the day she delivered her findings to the territorial authorities, knowing exactly what it would cost her. Knowing her family's business arrangements depended on that corruption. Knowing they would never forgive her for choosing justice over profit. She'd been 21 then, young enough to still hope they might understand, old enough to know better. When does he expect her? Martha was already calculating. Elena could see it in the way her fingers tapped the table. He sent a wagon. It arrives Monday. Robert folded the letter with hands that were almost gentle, the way you might handle a winning lottery ticket. 4 days to prepare. 4 days to get her out of this house, Rebecca said, and there was no humor in it, now just plain relief. Elena stood. The chair scraped against the floor, loud in the sudden quiet. Elena, her mother said, where do you think you're going? Grandmother needs her medicine. Sit down, we're discussing your future. No. Elena's voice came out steady, which surprised her. You're discussing your relief. There's a difference. She walked out before anyone could respond, before the words they'd throw at her back could land. Her father would call it disrespect. Her mother would call it typical. Her sisters would call it proof that they were right to laugh. Let them call it whatever they wanted. She had a compress to change and medicine to measure, and an old woman upstairs who'd never called her difficult, never called her defective, never called her anything but granddaughter. The stairs creaked under her feet. Behind her, the laughter started again, muffled by the dining room door, but unmistakable in its cruelty. 4 days, she thought. 4 days until she left this house, forever shipped off to a stranger who thought he wanted her, but would realize his mistake soon enough. 4 days until she became someone else's disappointment instead of theirs. The familiar grief tried to rise in her throat, but she swallowed it down. She'd had 24 years of practice. Her grandmother's room smelled like lavender oil and old paper, the scent of a life lived long enough to be reduced to small comforts. The old woman lay propped against pillows, her eyes closed, but her breathing shallow in a way that said she was awake, just choosing not to engage with a world that had grown too painful to fully inhabit. Grandma Rose, Elena said softly, crossing to the bedside. The eyes opened, pale blue, clouded with age, but still sharp where it mattered. I heard them laughing. They're always laughing. Elena removed the compress from her grandmother's forehead, felt the tepid water set it aside. She prepared a fresh one, her hands moving through the familiar ritual. Not like that. That was the laughter of people who think they've won something. Rose studied her granddaughter's face. What have they won? Elena applied the fresh compress, adjusted the pillows, measured out the medicine with the careful precision her grandmother had taught her years ago. Only when all of it was done did she speak. A wealthy rancher from Coldwater Valley has asked for my hand. Father accepted. Rose was quiet for a long moment. Then, you've never met this man. Apparently I have. 5 years ago in Riverside, I don't remember it. But he remembers you. So he says. And your family thinks this is funny because Rose's breath caught as understanding arrived. Because they think he doesn't know what he's asking for. Elena sat in the chair beside the bed, the one she'd occupied for hundreds of hours over the past 2 years, as her grandmother's health failed. They think they're getting revenge, sending their defective daughter to trick an innocent man. You are not defective. I expose corruption. I question authority. I help people my family thinks are beneath our notice. Elena's voice stayed level because emotion was a luxury she couldn't afford. By their standards, I'm completely broken. Rose's hand, thin as paper and twice as fragile, reached for Elena's. The grip was stronger than it should have been. Listen to me, this man, this Nathan Stone, he asked for you specifically. 5 years ago in Riverside. Think, child. What were you doing in Riverside 5 years ago? Elena closed her eyes, reaching back through the years. Riverside. She'd been 19, accompanying her sisters to the market, bored with their endless examination of fabrics and gossip. There'd been a commotion near the livestock pens. An old man accused of theft by a merchant who, her eyes opened. The chicken merchant, Jake Morrison. He was trying to cheat an old man, claiming he'd stolen a hen when he'd only touched it to check if it was healthy. And what did you do? I bought the chicken, gave it to the old man. Rose's smile was small but genuine. And someone saw you do it, someone who remembered, or someone who saw a naive girl make a fool of herself. Elena pulled her hand back, walked to the window. Outside, the garden needed weeding. It always needed weeding. She was the only one who ever bothered. Either way, Father's right. Once this Nathan Stone realizes what he's actually getting, he'll regret asking. I'll be stuck in a marriage with a man who thinks he made a mistake, which is marginally better than living here, but not by much. Or, Rose said quietly, you'll be free. The word hung in the air like a promise, like a lie, like something too dangerous to hope for. Elena leaned her forehead against the cool glass. In the garden below, Rebecca and Margaret had emerged, their heads bent together in conversation, their laughter carrying up through the open window, probably planning her humiliation, probably already imagining the letters they'd received from Coldwater Valley from Nathan Stone himself, describing his horror at what they'd sent him. I'm going to miss you, Elena said, because it was the only true thing she could offer. No, you're not. Rose's voice carried the firmness of someone who'd lived too long to tolerate dishonesty. You're going to miss the version of me who could still get out of this bed and protect you, but that woman died 2 years ago. What's left is just stubborn bones and memories. That's not, Elena. Look at me. She turned from the window, met her grandmother's eyes. You have been trying to earn their love for 24 years. It hasn't worked yet. It will never work. Some people are not capable of loving anything that makes them examine themselves, and you, my darling girl, are a mirror they cannot bear to look into. Rose shifted against her pillows, the effort costing her something she tried to hide. So stop trying, take whatever chance this is, mistake or miracle, and use it. Get out of this house, build a different life, be done with them. The tears came then, hot and unwelcome, because grief and hope felt too similar when they arrived at the same time. Elena wiped them away with the back of her hand, angry at herself for the weakness. What if he's worse? What if I'm just trading one prison for another? Then you'll survive it. You've survived this. Rose's hand gestured vaguely at the room, the house, the family that occupied it, like a hostile force. And if you're very lucky, you'll discover that a man who remembered one act of kindness over 5 years is not a man who thinks kindness is weakness. Elena wanted to believe it, wanted it so badly she could taste it, bitter and sweet, like medicine that might heal or might poison depending on the dose. But hope was expensive, and she'd learned to budget her emotional resources carefully. Hope spent poorly left you with nothing. 4 days, she said instead. I have 4 days. Then don't waste them preparing to fail. Prepare to be surprised. Rose closed her eyes again, settling back into the pillows. Now go pack. And Elena, yes, pack light. Only take what you'll need to build something new. Leave everything that reminds you of what they think you are. Elena kissed her grandmother's forehead, breathed in the lavender and old paper smell, and tried to memorize it because she knew they both knew that they wouldn't see each other again. Rose was dying by inches, and 4 days from now, Elena would be gone, and some goodbyes happened in silent rooms without anyone saying the actual words. She left the compress on the bedside table, the medicine measured and ready, and walked back into the hallway where her life was already being dismantled by people who thought they were punishing her with freedom. The next 4 days passed in a strange, suspended animation, like watching yourself drown from above the water. Elena packed her trunk with the few possessions she owned that weren't hand-me-downs from her sisters. 3 dresses she'd sewn herself, 2 books her grandmother had given her, the small leather journal where she documented the magistrate's corruption, and 100 other small injustices. She packed her grandmother's silver brush. She packed the pressed flowers from the one summer she'd been genuinely happy, age 12, before she'd learned that speaking truth was a crime in this house. Her family treated her like a ghost already gone. They spoke around her, at meals, through her in hallways, as if she'd already departed, and they were just waiting for the body to catch up. Rebecca tried on Elena's discarded dresses, declaring them too plain to bother with. Margaret boxed up Elena's books, the few others she'd collected over the years, and claimed them for herself. Martha went through Elena's room and removed anything of value which wasn't much, declaring it belonged to the family, not to the daughter who'd betrayed them. Elena let it all happen. Possessions were just weight. She'd learned that lesson watching families lose everything to corrupt officials her father did business with. You couldn't hold on to things when the world was designed to take them from you. You could only hold on to who you were, and even that required constant vigilance. On Saturday evening, she found Margaret in the hallway outside her room. Her sister leaned against the wall with practiced casualness, but her eyes held something complicated. Guilt, maybe, or just the discomfort of watching cruelty and doing nothing to stop it. You could refuse, Margaret said. Tell them you won't go. Elena folded the sheet she'd been carrying. And stay here. It's not. Margaret stopped because they both knew finishing that sentence would require a lie. It was that bad. It had always been that bad. He's a stranger. You don't know anything about him. I know he owns a successful ranch. I know he asked for me specifically. I know he's not you or father or mother or Rebecca. Elena met her sister's eyes. That's enough. What if he's cruel? Then I'll have practice surviving it. Margaret flinched like she'd been slapped. We're not. Yes, you are. Elena's voice stayed soft because anger was wasted on people who couldn't hear it. You've been cruel my entire life. You just call it something else so you can sleep at night. Discipline, correction, tough love. But it's still cruelty, Margaret. It's always been cruelty. Her sister's face did something complicated. For a moment, Elena thought she might actually apologize, might actually acknowledge the years of small cuts and large wounds. But then Margaret's expression smoothed into the mask she wore for the world, the one that said everything was fine and anyone who said otherwise was overreacting. I hope he makes you happy, Margaret said, and it might have been sincere. It might have been another cut disguised as kindness. With her family, Elena had never learned to tell the difference. I hope he leaves me alone, Elena replied, because happiness seemed like an unreasonable ambition. That would be enough. Sunday passed in silence. Elena spent it with her grandmother, reading aloud from books Rose had loved as a girl, stories of women who had crossed continents, who'd built lives in impossible places, who'd survived what shouldn't have been survivable. Adventure stories disguised as romance novels. Survival guides disguised as fairy tales. That's what you are, Rose said when Elena finished the last chapter. One of those women. I'm a woman being shipped to a stranger to solve my father's financial problems. You're a woman getting out. Rose's breathing had grown more labored over the weekend, each word costing her something. Don't diminish it just because they think it's a punishment. Freedom is freedom, even when it comes wrapped in someone else's malice. Elena held her grandmother's hand and said nothing because there was nothing left to say. They'd already said goodbye in all the ways that mattered. The actual departure on Monday morning would just be theater, a performance for people who'd already written the final act. That night, Elena lay in her narrow bed and listened to the house settle around her sister's whispered conversation through the thin walls, her mother's footsteps in the hallway checking locks, ensuring everything was secure. Her father's cough from the master bedroom, the sound of a man who'd smoked too many cigars, celebrating deals that required other people's suffering. Tomorrow she would leave. Tomorrow she would climb into a wagon sent by a stranger and travel to Coldwater Valley and meet the man who'd asked for her, specifically who'd remembered one small act of kindness for 5 years, who had no idea what he was actually getting because her family had made certain he couldn't know. She thought about the chicken merchant, about Jake Morrison's angry red face and the old man's terror, and her own 19-year-old fury at the injustice of it all. $2 for a chicken she'd given away. $2 that had apparently changed her entire life, though she hadn't known it at the time. Who had been watching? Who had seen? Who had remembered? The questions circled through her mind like birds unable to land, like prayers sent to a God who might or might not be listening, like hope dressed up as curiosity, so it didn't hurt quite so much when it died. Monday morning arrived with fog thick enough to swallow the world. Elena, dressed in her best dress, which wasn't saying much, and braided her hair into a simple plait because elaborate styling had never been her gift. She looked in the small mirror above her dresser and saw what her family saw, a woman too tall, too plain, too angular, too everything that made men uncomfortable and women dismissive. A woman whose hands showed evidence of work. a woman whose face showed evidence of thought. Her mother had once told her that thinking made a woman ugly, that intelligence showed in the face like a defect that men could see it and were repelled by it. Elena had been 14. She'd spent a week trying not to think before she realized the entire premise was absurd. Thinking wasn't optional. It was who she was. She carried her trunk downstairs herself because her father's men had already left for the fields, and neither of her sisters would help. The wagon was waiting in the drive, a well-made vehicle pulled by two sturdy horses. The driver was a man in his 50s, with weather-carved features and kind eyes that looked like they'd seen too much and decided to be gentle anyway. "Miss Mercer." He touched his hat. "I'm Charles. Mr. Stone sent me to bring you home." Home. The word landed strange, too big for her mouth, too hopeful for the moment. This wasn't home. Home was a place where people knew you and loved you anyway, and she'd never had that, not once in 24 years, except maybe with her grandmother, who was dying upstairs and couldn't come down to say goodbye, even if Elena could bear to make her try. "Thank you," Elena said, because manners cost nothing, even when your heart was breaking. Charles loaded her trunk, small, light, containing so little of a life that you could fit it in a box and still have room left over, and then offered his hand to help her up to the seat. His grip was steady. His palm was calloused in a way that said he was a working man, not decorative help. She liked him immediately, which seemed dangerous. Hope was expensive, and she'd already spent too much. Her family assembled on the porch like they were seeing off a beloved daughter instead of disposing of a problem. Rebecca and Margaret wore matching expressions of barely concealed glee. Martha clutched her handkerchief in a performance of maternal sorrow that wouldn't have convinced anyone who'd known her for more than 5 minutes. Robert stood with his arms crossed, his face wearing satisfaction the way other men wore cologne. "Be good," Martha called the words automatic, meaningless. "Write to us," Rebecca added, and both sisters had to smother their laughter. Elena looked at them, really looked, trying to find something worth remembering, some small moment of genuine connection she could carry with her. But there was nothing, just the same faces that had told her for 24 years that she was wrong, was broken, was less than, was too much. Just the same people who'd punished her for being exactly what she was and then mocked her for not being different. "Goodbye," she said, and meant it in every possible way. Charles clicked his tongue at the horses, and they moved forward, pulling the wagon down the drive. Elena didn't look back. Lot's wife had looked back and turned to salt, and Elena had always thought that was less about divine punishment and more about natural consequence. Some things behind you would kill you if you gave them the chance. The fog swallowed the house within minutes. The road stretched ahead, dirt-packed hard, from 1,000 previous journeys, leading away from everything she knew toward everything she didn't. Charles drove in companionable silence, the kind that said he understood the weight of leaving and wasn't going to make her perform gratitude or excitement or any of the other emotions people expected from a bride traveling to meet her groom. An hour into the journey, he finally spoke. "Mr. Stone's a good man." Elena watched the landscape roll by, fields giving way to forest-cultivated land becoming wild. "You work for him?" 15 years. Was there when he bought the first acre. Charles guided the horses around a rough patch in the road. Watched him build everything from nothing. "He's fair, pays well, treats his people right." "That's good." She meant it, even though it felt like trying to hold water in cupped hands. You knew it would eventually slip through, but you appreciated it while it lasted. "He's been waiting for you," Charles said. The words hung in the air between them, strange and impossible. "He doesn't know me." "Maybe, maybe not." Charles was quiet for a long moment. "All I know is 3 years ago he started asking questions about families in Riverside, about daughters, about a girl who'd bought a chicken for a stranger. Took him 2 years to track down which family it was, another year to figure out how to approach it proper." Elena's heart did something complicated in her chest. "Why would he do that?" "That's a question for him, miss. But I'll tell you this, whatever he saw in you that day, he's been carrying it with him since. A man doesn't search for 3 years for someone he's not serious about." The implications unfurled like a map showing territories she'd never imagined existed. He'd searched for her, deliberately, specifically. Which meant either he was obsessed, possible men, had strange ideas about women and ownership, and the stories they told themselves about both, or he'd genuinely been affected by one small act of basic human decency 5 years ago, which seemed equally improbable, but less dangerous. Does he know, Elena asked, about my family's reputation, about why they agreed so quickly? Charles's mouth twitched. He knows enough. Your father's business dealings aren't exactly secret, miss. Most of the territory knows what kind of man Robert Mercer is. And he still wants to marry into that family. He wants to marry you. There's a difference. Elena let the words settle, tested them for lies, found none. Charles wasn't being paid to flatter her. He had no reason to build her up just to watch her fall. He was simply stating facts the way you might describe the weather or the quality of the road. Nathan Stone wanted her specifically, had searched for her specifically, had spent 3 years tracking her down and another year figuring out the proper approach. It should have been romantic. Instead, it was terrifying. The miles passed, the fog lifted, revealing countryside that grew progressively more beautiful as they traveled west. Rolling hills gave way to valleys where rivers ran clear and forests grew thick with pine. They passed through 2 small towns where Charles was greeted by name, where people frowned and smiled and seemed genuinely pleased to see him. These were places where kindness still functioned as currency, where corruption hadn't yet rotted the foundations, where maybe, just maybe, a woman who spoke truth wouldn't be punished for it. Or maybe she was building in fairy tales again. Hope dressed up as observation, reality distorted by desperate wish fulfillment. We'll stop for lunch in Pinewood, Charles said as the sun climbed toward noon. Mrs. Chen runs the inn there, makes the best dumplings in 3 counties. They ate at a small table near the window, while Mrs. Chen fussed over Elena like a grandmother, with a favorite grandchild piling her plate high despite her protests. The dumplings were perfect, delicate wrappers, savory filling just the right amount of spice. Elena ate slowly, trying to memorize the taste, the way the sunlight fell through the windows, the sound of other people's laughter in the background. This moment might be the last simple happiness she'd experienced for a while, and she wanted to hold on to it. First time meeting Nathan, Mrs. Chen asked, settling into the chair across from them. Elena nodded, her mouth full. He's a good boy, man, I should say. Hard to remember he's not the 20-year-old who used to eat at my counter anymore. Mrs. Chen's smile carried the weight of years. He's been through some hard things. Lost his sister 3 years back. Changed him. Made him quieter. But not bitter. That's the important thing. Elena swallowed carefully. What happened to his sister? Mrs. Chen's expression flickered with old grief. Bridge collapsed north of here. Shoddy construction official got paid off to approve it anyway. Sarah was crossing when it gave way, only 20 years old. The dumpling turned to stone in Elena's stomach. She knew that bridge, knew that scandal. Had been the one who'd tried to document it, who'd gathered evidence of the bribes, who'd delivered the information to authorities, who'd done nothing because the official had friends in the territorial government. Her father had been furious. Their business depended on that official's willingness to look the other way on several lucrative deals. I remember that, Elena said quietly. I tried to report the corruption. No one listened. Mrs. Chen's eyes sharpened with sudden understanding. You're that girl, the one who tried to stop it. I failed. You tried. Most people don't even do that. Mrs. Chen reached across the table and squeezed Elena's hand. Nathan knows you tried. He knows what it cost you. Your father made sure everyone knew his daughter had betrayed him, thought it would make you pariah. But some of us remember things different. Some of us remember a girl who cared more about justice than profit. Elena's vision blurred. She blinked hard, refusing to cry in a public dining room over dumplings and old grief. Does he know I'm the one who tried to report it? He knows everything about you, child. That's why he asked. Mrs. Chen's smile was sad and knowing. He's not looking for a pretty face or a convenient alliance. He's looking for someone who sees the same things he sees, who cares about the same things he cares about. Someone who would have saved his sister if the world had been different. The weight of it settled over Elena like a blanket, warm and suffocating at once. Nathan Stone hadn't just remembered a small kindness with a chicken. He'd lost his sister to the same corruption Elena had fought against. He'd learned that Elena had tried to stop it, had sacrificed her family's approval to do the right thing. And he'd decided that was worth searching for, worth waiting for, worth asking for specifically. It wasn't romantic. It was heavier than that, more complicated, more dangerous. He was looking for someone who'd already failed once to make a difference. Someone who'd paid the price for trying and would probably have to pay it again. Someone who understood that doing the right thing cost everything and did it anyway. I don't know if I'm who he thinks I am, Elena said. None of us are ever who other people think we are. That's what marriage is for, figuring out who people actually are and deciding if you can live with it. Mrs. Chen stood collecting their empty plates. But at least you're starting from the same page. That's more than most couples get. They left Pinewood with full stomachs and heavier hearts. The afternoon sun warmed the wagon as they climbed into higher country, following roads that grew narrower and more winding as they approached Coldwater Valley. The landscape opened up around them, mountains to the west, valleys rolling out below rivers, cutting silver lines through green earth. That's Stone Ranch, Charles said, pointing to a cluster of buildings in the distance. Another hour and we'll be there. Elena's hands twisted in her lap. An hour, 60 minutes, 3,600 seconds before her life changed completely, before she met the man who'd been searching for her, before she discovered whether this was rescue or just another trap with prettier walls. The ranch grew larger as they approached, resolving from distant shapes into actual structures. The main house was substantial, but not ostentatious, 2 stories of solid, a wide porch wrapping around 3 sides of windows that caught the afternoon light and threw it back. Behind it stretched barns, corrals, worker housing, all of it laid out with the kind of careful planning that spoke to someone who understood how land worked, how buildings should serve function, how communities needed structure. This was wealth, but it was earned wealth, built wealth, the kind that came from years of work rather than decades of extraction. Elena's father would have sneered at it, called it rustic, called it beneath a man of real standing. But her father's wealth had been built on other people's suffering, and this, whatever this was, looked like it might have been built on something else. The wagon rolled to a stop in front of the main house. Elena's heart hammered so hard she thought Charles might hear it. Her palms were sweating. Her breath came too fast. This was ridiculous. She was 24 years old, had survived 24 years of her family's cruelty, had exposed corruption and faced consequences, and rebuilt herself a dozen times. She could handle meeting one man who had asked to marry her, but knowing something intellectually and feeling it emotionally were 2 different countries, and she was currently trapped between borders, unable to claim citizenship in either. The front door opened. A man stepped out onto the porch, and Elena's world tilted sideways. He was tall, taller than she'd expected, with broad shoulders that spoke of physical work, not decorative posture. His hair was dark, touched with gray at the temples, despite his relative youth. His face was weathered but kind, carrying lines around the eyes that suggested he smiled more than he frowned. But it was his eyes that caught her, held her, refused to let her look away. Dark brown and direct, the kind of eyes that saw things and didn't pretend not to, that looked at you and into you and through you all at once. And in them, Elena saw recognition. Not the polite recognition of meeting someone you'd been told about, but the specific recognition of seeing someone you'd been searching for. Someone you'd been carrying in memory for 5 years. Someone you'd given up hope of finding and then found anyway through sheer stubborn persistence. Nathan Stone looked at her like she was the answer to a question he'd been asking since before he knew what the question was. Elena Mercer, he said, and his voice was low and steady, the kind that didn't need to shout to be heard, that carried authority without demanding it. Thank you for coming. She climbed down from the wagon with as much dignity as she could manage, which wasn't much because her legs had forgotten how to support her weight properly. Charles caught her elbow, steadying her, then stepped back with a small, knowing smile. Mr. Stone, Elena said, and was grateful her voice worked. Thank you for having me. Your letter was, she stopped, because what could she say? Your letter was the cruelest gift my family could imagine giving me. Your letter made them laugh at the idea of tricking you. Your letter might be the only thing that saves my life, and I don't even know if I can trust it. Unexpected. Nathan finished for her, and there was something in his expression. Humor, maybe? Or understanding, or the kind of gentleness that came from knowing what it was like to be hurt by people who should have protected you. I imagine it was. He came down the porch steps, stopped a careful distance away, close enough to speak without shouting, but far enough to respect boundaries. The sun caught the gray in his hair, turned it silver. He looked older than 33 and tired, and like someone who'd been carrying grief so long, he'd learned to move with its weight. I need you to know something before we go any further, Nathan said. I know what your family thinks this is. I know they agreed because they think they're playing a trick on me. I know they sent you believing I'd be disappointed when I discovered who you really are. Elena's breath stopped somewhere between her lungs and her throat. But I asked for you specifically, Elena, not because I don't know who you are, because I do. He held her gaze steady and sure. 5 years ago in Riverside, I watched you spend your own money to buy a chicken from a man who was cheating an elder, and then you gave that chicken to a stranger who needed it. I watched your sisters drag you away while you looked back to make sure the old man was safe. I watched you choose kindness when it would have been easier not to. The world narrowed to just his voice, just his eyes, just the truth unspooling between them, like thread connecting past to present to possible future. I searched for you for 3 years. Took me another year to figure out how to approach your father without him slamming the door in my face. And when I finally sent that letter asking for your hand, I knew exactly who I was asking for. Nathan's expression shifted, became something more vulnerable, more careful. I know about the magistrate, about the bridge that killed my sister, about how you tried to stop it and no one listened. I know you've been punished your whole life for having a conscience, and I need you to know that I don't think that's a defect. I think that's exactly what this world needs more of. Elena couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't process the enormity of what he'd just said, what he'd just offered, what he'd just revealed about himself and about her and about this whole impossible situation. But Nathan continued, and the word landed like a stone in still water. I also need you to know that you have a choice here. I'm not your father. This isn't a prison. If you want to marry me, if you want to try to build something together, then I'll be honored. But if you want me to help you find somewhere else to go, somewhere safe where your family can't find you, I'll do that too. No questions asked. No obligations. You don't owe me anything, Elena. Not for searching, not for asking, not for any of this. The tears came then hot and unwelcome and impossible to stop. They tracked down her cheeks while the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, turning the world into something beautiful, while Elena stood in the middle of it and tried to understand what it meant to be offered choice, to be offered freedom, to be offered the possibility that maybe, just maybe, someone saw her clearly and didn't want her to be different. I don't understand, she managed finally. Why would you search for me for 3 years based on one chicken? Nathan's smile was sad and knowing. Because I watched someone see injustice and couldn't look away. Because I've spent my whole life in a world where most people choose comfort over conscience, and you chose conscience anyway. Because my sister was like you, stubborn and brave and completely incapable of pretending not to see suffering when it was right in front of her, and she died because corrupt men valued profit over lives, and you tried to stop those same men even though you knew it would cost you everything. He paused, then added quietly, and because I've been lonely for someone who understands that doing the right thing isn't always the smart thing, but it's still the right thing anyway. Lena wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, smearing tears across her cheek like evidence of weakness she couldn't hide. I'm not your sister. I know. You're you. That's what I'm hoping for. The sun touched the mountain peaks, began its slow descent toward night. Charles had disappeared somewhere, probably deliberately leaving them alone in the golden hour light. The ranch stretched around them. Land and buildings and the evidence and the years of work of life built one decision at a time of choices made and consequences accepted in the slow accumulation of something that might be worth calling home. I don't know how to do this, Elena said. I don't know how to trust someone who says they value things my family punished me for. I don't know how to believe this is real and not just another version of the same trap with a prettier door. That's fair, Nathan said. I don't know how to do this either. I've never been married, never even been close. I'm better with land and cattle than I am with people, and I have a tendency to get too focused on work and forget to sleep. I snore apparently, though I've never had anyone around to confirm it. I can't dance. I make terrible coffee. And I've spent the last 3 years building up this moment in my head so much that the reality probably can't match it, which means we're both going to be disappointed in different ways. Despite everything, Elena almost smiled. That's not a very convincing marriage proposal. That's because I'm not proposing, not yet. Nathan gestured toward the house. I'm offering you a trial period. Let's spend some time getting to know each other. No pressure, no obligations. Just two people figuring out if they can build a life together. And at the end of it, if you decide this isn't what you want, I'll help you go wherever you need to go. My word on it. Elena looked at the house at the ranch at this man who'd spent 3 years searching for her based on one small act of basic human decency. She thought about her family, about their laughter, about their certainty that they'd played a perfect trick on an innocent man. She thought about her grandmother's words. Freedom is freedom, even when it comes wrapped in someone else's malice. How long, she asked. 4 weeks, a month to decide if you can tolerate me and if I'm anything like what you hope for, which I'm probably not. I didn't hope for anything. Hope is expensive. Nathan's expression softened with something that looked like recognition. Then let's make it simple. 4 weeks. I'll show you the ranch, introduce you to the people who work here, let you see what the life actually looks like. You'll show me who you are, not who your family says you are. And at the end, we'll both decide if this makes sense or if we're just two lonely people mistaking company for compatibility. It was the most honest thing anyone had ever offered her. No promises of happiness or love or even basic contentment. Just the offer of time of choice, of the possibility that maybe they could figure it out together instead of having it dictated by parents who valued profit over people. Elena took a breath, let it out, made a choice. 4 weeks, she agreed, but I need you to know something too. I'm not going to pretend to be different than I am. I'm going to keep seeing injustice and being unable to ignore it. I'm going to keep asking uncomfortable questions and challenging things that don't make sense. I'm going to keep being exactly what my family said made me defective because that's who I am and I don't know how to be anyone else. Nathan's smile was genuine this time, reaching his eyes. Good. That's exactly what I'm hoping for. He offered his hand and Elena took it, feeling the calluses on his palm that matched her own, the strength in his grip that didn't try to crush hers, the warmth of skin against skin, like a promise that hadn't been spoken yet, but might be given time. Welcome to Stone Ranch, Nathan said. Let me show you around before the sun sets completely. The house first, then the barns, if you're interested. Tomorrow I'll introduce you to everyone. But tonight, let's just be two people having dinner and trying not to make this more complicated than it needs to be. He led her toward the house, and Elena followed, and somewhere in the distance, her family was probably celebrating their successful revenge, completely unaware that they'd just given her exactly what she'd needed most. A door that opened in, instead of out, a chance to be herself without punishment, and a man who'd been searching 3 years for someone exactly like her. The fairy tale had always said the princess had to be rescued. But maybe rescue looked different than the story said. Maybe rescue looked like a man offering choice instead of demands. Maybe rescue looked like 4 weeks to figure yourself out without anyone telling you who you were supposed to be. Maybe rescue looked like this, a ranch at sunset, a stranger who'd been waiting, and the terrifying possibility that sometimes the thing that looks like punishment is actually the beginning of freedom. The morning came too early, announced by roosters who had no concept of mercy and sunlight that sliced through curtains with surgical precision. Elena woke in a bed that wasn't hers, in a room that smelled like cedar and beeswax, instead of her family's particular blend of judgment and old perfume. For 3 heartbeats, she forgot where she was, reached for familiar landmarks in the darkness behind her eyelids, found none. Then memory arrived with its usual cruelty. The wagon, the man on the porch, the offer of 4 weeks that had sounded like salvation last night. And this morning felt more like a test she was already failing. She'd slept in her chemise because unpacking had seemed too permanent, too presumptuous. Her trunk sat unopened in the corner where Nathan had placed it last night, carrying it himself despite her protests, his hands gentle with her few possessions, in a way that made her throat tight. He'd shown her to this room. The guest room, he'd clarified, not his room, never his room, unless she invited it and left her with fresh water in the basin and clean towels and the kind of privacy her family had never offered. The house had been quiet all night. No whispered conversations bleeding through thin walls. No footsteps checking locks and reinforcing prisons. Just silence and wind in the pines and the distant sound of cattle settling for the evening. Elena had lain awake for hours trying to decide if the quiet was peaceful or just a different kind of trap. Now she dressed in yesterday's clothes because they were the only clean things she had braided her hair, with fingers that trembled slightly from nerves masquerading as efficiency, and tried to prepare herself for whatever this day would demand. First morning set precedents. She'd learned that lesson watching her family establish hierarchies every time someone new entered their orbit. The first morning told you where you stood, what was expected, what would be forgiven, and what would be held against you forever. She found Nathan in the kitchen, which was surprising enough that she stopped in the doorway. Men of his standing didn't cook their own breakfast. They had people for that, servants or wives or daughters pressed into domestic service. But here he stood at the stove stirring something in a cast-iron pan, his sleeves rolled to his elbows and his hair slightly mussed like he'd run his hands through it too many times. He looked up, caught her watching, smiled. "I warned you about the coffee. Wasn't lying." The pot on the stove emanated something that smelled like burned tar and broken promises. Elena approached cautiously. "That bad? Worse. Charles says it's an act of violence against innocent beings." Nathan gestured to the pan. "But I can manage eggs, and there's bread from Mrs. Chen. She sent it back with Charles yesterday, probably knowing I'd poison you otherwise. Sit, unless you want to take over, which I'd support enthusiastically." Elena hesitated, caught between ingrained obedience and the strange new freedom of being offered choice. In her family's house, women didn't sit while men cooked. Women served silently and efficiently, and any deviation brought consequences. But Nathan was already pulling out a chair, already dishing eggs onto two plates, already acting like this was normal, like men and women could share kitchen work without the foundations of civilization crumbling. She sat, accepted the plate he offered, watched him pour 2 cups of the offensive coffee and slide one across the table with an apologetic grimace. "Fair warning," he said, settling into the chair across from her. "Everything I know about hospitality I learned from Mrs. Chen, which means I'm probably doing this wrong, according to every rule your mother taught you." "My mother taught me that women exist to make men comfortable and silent." Elena cut into her eggs perfectly cooked, actually not the disaster he'd threatened. "So by that standard, you're already failing." Nathan's smile flickered with something that might have been relief. "Good. I was worried you'd spend 4 weeks trying to be what you thought I expected instead of who you actually are." "I don't know how to be what people expect. I've tried for 24 years and never managed it." "Then stop trying." He doctored his coffee with enough sugar to qualify as dessert. "I told you yesterday I asked for you because of who you are not despite it. If you start performing some version of yourself you think I'll like better, we're both wasting our time." The words sat between them like an offering, like a challenge, like the most dangerous gift anyone had ever tried to give her. Elena sipped her coffee. He'd been right, it was terrible, tasted like the devil's bathwater, and tried to figure out what game he was playing. Because people didn't just offer you permission to be yourself without wanting something in return. There was always a catch, always a price, always the moment when they'd turn around and punish you for being exactly what they'd claimed to want. But Nathan just ate his eggs and looked out the window at his land, his expression carrying the particular contentment of someone who'd built something worth keeping. The morning light caught his profile, highlighted the gray in his hair, the lines around his eyes, the evidence of years lived at hard angles. He looked solid in a way her father never had. Rooted. Like storms might bend him, but wouldn't break him, and he'd be standing in the same place when the wind died down. "What happened yesterday," Elena said carefully, "with my family. You should know they are probably already writing to you, probably already crafting letters that make me sound worse than I am, just to ensure you understand what a mistake you have made." Nathan set down his fork. "Let them write, I won't read them. They'll be convincing. They're very good at making me sound like a problem that needed solving." "Elena." He waited until she met his eyes. "I spent 3 years searching for you and another year figuring out how to ask for you. Do you really think a few letters from people who couldn't see your value are going to change my mind in 4 weeks? They changed everyone else's mind. I'm not everyone else." He leaned back in his chair, considering her with that direct gaze that made her feel simultaneously seen and transparent. "And I need you to understand something. Whatever your family told you about yourself, whatever they made you believe about your worth, that was them, not you. They diminished you because your conscience made them examine their choices, and people who profit from corruption can't tolerate that kind of mirror." Elena's throat closed around words that wanted to come out broken. She swallowed them down, focused on her eggs, tried to maintain some dignity, while her carefully constructed defenses cracked like old plaster. You sound very certain about people you've never met. I know their type. I've spent 33 years watching men choose profit over principle and then justify it by claiming anyone who objects is naive or difficult or just doesn't understand how the world works. Nathan's voice carried old anger, the kind that had been refined by time, into something harder than rage, more useful than bitterness. My sister died because men like your father made choices that valued their wealth over other people's lives. So yes, I'm certain about who they are, and I'm certain that you're nothing like them. The silence that followed had weight. Elena could feel it pressing on her chest, making breath difficult. She wanted to argue with him, wanted to list all the ways she'd failed, all the times she'd been too much or not enough, all the evidence her family had compiled over 24 years proving she was defective. But the words wouldn't come. They sat lodged somewhere between her lungs and her mouth, too heavy to lift, too sharp to swallow. Finish your eggs, Nathan said finally, his voice gentling. Then I'll show you the ranch. Unless you'd rather rest, you traveled all day yesterday, and I'm not expecting you to jump straight into work. I'd rather see it. Elena forced herself to eat, though the eggs had lost their taste. I'm not good at resting. That makes two of us. They finished breakfast in companionable quiet, the kind that didn't demand conversation or performance, that just let silence be what it was without needing to fill it with noise. Nathan cleared the plates, washed them in the basin with efficiency that spoke to years of practice, then grabbed his hat from the hook by the door. Outside, the ranch woke around them. Workers emerged from the bunkhouse, calling greetings to Nathan that he returned by name. Horses nickered in the corral, anticipating their morning feed. Somewhere a dog barked, joyful and insistent. The sun climbed higher, burning off the last wisps of morning fog, revealing the full scope of the operation. It was bigger than Elena had realized yesterday. Fields stretched toward the mountains, some planted with hay, others left for grazing. Cattle dotted the landscape like slow-moving clouds. Barns and outbuildings stood in precise arrangement, each serving a clear purpose. Everything maintained with the care of someone who understood that small negligences accumulated into large failures. We run about 300 head of cattle, Nathan said as they walked toward the nearest barn. Used to be 500, but I scaled back after Sarah died. Couldn't focus on the work, and the animals suffered for it. Took me 2 years to rebuild properly. And now I'm ready to expand again. But carefully. I learned the hard way that growth without structure just means bigger problems. He pushed open the barn door, revealing rows of stalls occupied by horses in various states of interest. These are the working horses. We've got another 20 in the far pasture, younger stock not trained yet. Elena stepped inside, breathing in hay and leather and horse. Her family had kept horses, but they'd been decorative animals, status symbols maintained by hired hands. These were working creatures, muscular and calm, their eyes showing intelligence and trust. One bay mare stretched her nose toward Elena, lips working in anticipation of treats. That's Rosie, Nathan said. She's pushy but reliable. Charles's favorite. Elena stroked the mare's nose, felt the velvet warmth of it, the immediate, uncomplicated affection that animals offered when they weren't mistreated. You have a lot of workers. 15 full-time, another dozen seasonal during branding and harvest. All of them live on the ranch. There's housing behind the main barn. Fair wages, guaranteed work year-round if they want it, and I don't ask questions about where they came from or what they're running from. Nathan leaned against the stall door, watching her with that steady gaze. Half my workers are men other ranchers wouldn't hire. Former prisoners, mostly, are men who made mistakes and paid for them and just want a chance to start over without everyone holding their past against them forever. That's dangerous. That's fair. Men who've been given second chances tend to be loyal to the people who gave them. And everyone deserves the opportunity to be more than the worst thing they have ever done. Elena thought about her own mistakes, about the magistrate and the bridge, and every time she'd chosen conscience over convenience. Her family had never forgiven her, had never even considered that maybe standing up to corruption was worth celebrating instead of punishing. But here was a man who deliberately hired people everyone else had discarded, who built his workforce from society's rejected pieces, who seemed to genuinely believe that redemption was possible for people willing to do the work. "You're going to get taken advantage of," she said. "Sometimes it's happened." Nathan's expression remained calm, unbothered by the warning. But the men who appreciate the chance outnumber the ones who abuse it 10 to 1. And I'd rather give 10 men opportunities and have one betray me than refuse to help anyone because I'm afraid of being hurt. That's idealistic. That's practical. Loyal workers are better than resentful ones, and men who feel valued work harder than men who feel disposable. He pushed away from the stall, gestured toward the door. "Come on, I'll introduce you to some of them." They spent the morning walking the ranch, Nathan introducing her to workers who regarded Elena with curiosity tempered by caution. These were men who'd learned not to make assumptions, who'd been judged too quickly too often to do the same to others. They nodded respectfully, answered her questions without elaboration, and returned to their tasks with the practiced efficiency of people who understood their place and valued it. By noon, Elena's feet ached and her dress was dusty, and she'd seen enough of the operation to start forming opinions, which was dangerous. Opinions led to suggestions, suggestions led to conflict, conflict led to punishment. She'd learned that pattern young and relearned it every time she forgot. But Nathan had told her to be herself, had specifically said he wanted to know who she actually was, not some performed version designed to make him comfortable. And if she was going to take him at his word, which was still an enormous gamble that might blow up spectacularly, then she needed to risk saying what she actually thought. They ate lunch on the porch, sandwiches assembled from Mrs. Chen's bread and cheese from Nathan's cold cellar, and vegetables from a garden Elena hadn't noticed yesterday. The food was simple but good, the kind that sustained without demanding attention. Nathan ate with the focus of someone who'd learned to fuel his body efficiently, not waste time on elaborate meals. "You have water problems," Elena said. Nathan paused mid-bite. "What?" "Your eastern fields. The cattle there look thinner than the ones near the house. The grass is sparser. They're not getting enough water." She gestured toward the distant fields. "You're relying on the creek, but it's too far for the cattle to walk comfortably in summer heat. They're undergrazing because the effort isn't worth the payoff." Nathan set down his sandwich, studying her with an intensity that made her want to retreat. She'd overstepped, should have kept quiet, should have known better than to criticize his operation on her second day, as if she had any right to judge his work, as if her observations mattered. "As if you're right," Nathan said. "I've been trying to figure out how to solve it for 2 years. The creek flow varies too much seasonally, and I can't afford to lose cattle to dehydration in August. But I haven't found a solution that doesn't cost more than I can justify spending." Elena blinked, processed his words, realized he wasn't angry, wasn't defensive, wasn't preparing to tell her that women didn't understand ranching and should keep their uninformed opinions to themselves. He was just listening, considering, treating her observation like it had value. "What if you built a reservoir system?" The words came out before she could stop them, before caution could reassert control. "Not a single large reservoir, those are expensive and require constant maintenance, but a series of smaller catchments scattered through the eastern fields. During spring runoff, they'd fill from the creek overflow. In summer, when the creek runs low, the cattle could use the stored water." Nathan leaned forward, his sandwich forgotten. Connected catchments, with simple channels. Shallow enough that you don't need to dig deep, wide enough that water flows naturally from one to the next based on gravity. Line them with clay if you have it, or stone if you don't. The cattle learn where they are within a few weeks, and you distribute grazing pressure more evenly across all your land instead of concentrating it near the creek. That's brilliant. That's basic watershed management. My grandmother's family ran sheep in Montana. She told me stories about how they handled water in drought years. Elena picked up her sandwich again, trying to appear casual, trying not to show how much his praise affected her. "It's not complicated, just requires planning and some labor." "Labor I have. Planning I thought I had, but apparently I've been missing something obvious." Nathan's smile was genuine, pleased in a way that had nothing to do with flattery and everything to do with recognizing a solution to a real problem. "Could you map it? Show me where you'd place the catchments." "I'd need to walk the fields, see the actual terrain, not just what's visible from here." "Tomorrow. We'll spend the whole day on it if we need to." Nathan was already calculating, she could see it in his expression, the way his eyes went distant while his mind worked through logistics. If this works, and I think it will, it solves a problem that's been costing me money and cattle for years. That's worth 4 weeks right there. Elena's throat tightened. I haven't done anything yet. You've seen something I missed it after staring at it for 2 years. That's not nothing. Nathan met her eyes again, direct and earnest. Elena, I'm not flattering you. I'm recognizing practical intelligence when I see it. Those are two different things, and I need you to know the difference. She nodded because words wouldn't come, because no one had ever looked at her like that before, like her mind was valuable, like her observations mattered, like intelligence was something to celebrate instead of something to hide because it made men uncomfortable and women resentful. The afternoon passed in a blur of additional introductions, more toward Nathan asking her opinion on various aspects of the operation, like her input actually mattered. By evening, Elena was exhausted, her mind full of observations and ideas. She didn't know if she'd ever be allowed to voice her heart, doing complicated things she didn't have names for. They ate dinner together at the kitchen table, stew that Nathan had made that morning left to simmer all day, surprisingly edible. The conversation meandered through safe topics, the weather, the neighboring ranches, Mrs. Chen's cooking, versus Nathan's disasters. But underneath ran a current of something else, something that felt like the beginning of trust, or at least the possibility of ocean. Can I ask you something, Elena said when the dishes were cleared and they'd moved to the porch to watch the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. Anything. Yesterday you said you'd been lonely for someone who understands that doing the right thing isn't always the smart thing. But you run a successful ranch, you're respected in the community, people clearly value you. How are you lonely? Nathan was quiet for a long moment, his expression distant. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of truths he didn't often share. You can be surrounded by people and still lonely if none of them see you clearly. If they value what you provide without caring who you are underneath. If you can't trust them with your doubts because they need you to be strong, need you to have answers, need you to be the stable foundation they've built their lives on. Elena understood that loneliness, had lived it every day in a house full of family who'd never once asked who she actually was beneath the disappointment they'd assigned her. And you think I see you clearly. I think you understanding what it costs to choose principle over comfort. That's rare enough to be worth searching for 3 years. Nathan turned to look at her, his face half in shadow. Most people think morality is easy, that good people just naturally do good things without effort. But you and I both know that's not true. Every time you choose justice over profit or honesty over convenience or someone else's welfare over your own comfort, it costs you something. And people who've never paid that price can't understand why you'd keep choosing to pay it. So you're lonely for someone who understands sacrifice. I'm lonely for someone who understands that sacrifice doesn't make you noble. It just makes you tired. His smile was sad knowing, and that sometimes you need someone who acknowledges the call without trying to convince you it wasn't worth it. Elena's vision blurred. She blinked hard, refusing to cry on the porch of a man she'd known for one full day, refusing to show weakness just because someone had finally named the exhaustion she'd been carrying alone for 24 years. Your sister. She understood. She did. And when she died, I lost the only person who could see me without needing me to be anything other than what I was. Nathan's voice stayed steady, but Elena could hear the grief underneath, the kind that had been refined by time into something you could live with but never fully healed. I've had 3 years to figure out how to be alone without being lonely. Mostly failed at it. Then I saw you in Riverside and thought maybe there was someone else who carried the same weight. Maybe I wasn't as alone as I thought. Or maybe you built me up in your head for 3 years and the reality is going to disappoint you catastrophically. That's possible, Nathan agreed. Or maybe we're both so convinced we're going to disappoint each other that we'll miss the part where we actually fit. The sun touched the mountain peaks, beginning its final descent. Elena watched the light change, watched shadows lengthen across the valley, watched the world transform from day to night through all the small increments that made the impossible feel inevitable. Somewhere in the darkness, cattle settled for the evening. Workers finished their tasks and retired to the bunkhouse. Life continued its ordinary rhythms while she sat on a stranger's porch and tried to decide if hope was affordable or if she was just buying disaster on credit. I'm going to map your water system tomorrow, she said finally. And if it doesn't work, if my idea is terrible and costs you money you can't afford to lose, I need you to tell me. Don't protect my feelings. Don't pretend it's fine when it's not. I've had enough people lie to me about my failures. If you're going to keep me here, at least be honest about when I'm wrong. Deal, but the same goes for you. Nathan stood, stretched, his joints popping in a way that spoke to years of physical labor. If I'm being an idiot about something, tell me. If you see me making a mistake, speak up. If you're unhappy or uncomfortable or just need space, say it. We're not going to build anything real if we're both performing for each other. Elena stood too, facing him in the dying light. I don't know how to do this. How to trust that honesty won't be punished. Neither do I. So we'll figure it out together and we'll both probably mess it up several times before we get it right. Nathan offered his hand, the gesture formal and careful, asking permission before assuming. Good night, Elena. Thank you for being here. She took his hand, felt the calluses match her own again, the warmth that suggested living flesh instead of cold performance. Good night, Nathan. Thank you for the terrible coffee. His laugh followed her into the house, into a room, into the bed that was starting to feel less like a guest room and more like somewhere she might be allowed to stay. She unpacked her trunk that night, hung her 3 dresses in the wardrobe, placed her grandmother's brush on the dresser, arranged her books on the small shelf. Small acts of permanence, dangerous commitments to the possibility that maybe this time would be different. Maybe this man was who he claimed to be. Maybe she could stop running from herself long enough to see if someone else could handle the weight of who she actually was. The next morning came easier than the first. Elena woke to roosters and sunlight, but this time remembered where she was before panic could take hold. She dressed in her most practical dress, dark brown, already showing signs of wear, perfect for walking fields and mapping water systems. Her family would have been scandalized. She felt liberated. Nathan had coffee ready again, still terrible he hadn't miraculously improved overnight, and eggs and fresh bread that Charles must have brought from Mrs. Chen before dawn. They ate quickly, efficiently, 2 people with work to do and limited patience for elaborate morning rituals. I'll pack lunch, Nathan said. We'll probably be out there most of the day. Elena helped assembling sandwiches and filling canteens, moving around the kitchen with an ease that surprised her. Her family's kitchen had been a battleground, every movement scrutinized, every mistake cataloged for future criticism. This kitchen was just a room where food happened, no more fraught than the barn or the porch, or any other space designed for function instead of performance. They rode out to the eastern fields on horses. Nathan saddled himself, refusing Elena's offer to help with the efficiency of someone who'd done this 10,000 times and didn't need assistance. The morning was cool, the kind of perfect late summer weather that wouldn't last, that needed to be appreciated before autumn arrived with its promises of change. Elena rode Rosie, the pushy mare from yesterday, who turned out to be surprisingly gentle once you established boundaries. Nathan rode a gelding he called Smoke Gray as his namesake, and twice as temperamental based on the way he tried to bite Nathan's leg while being mounted. He's affectionate, Nathan said, when Smoke settled into a ground-covering walk. That's an interesting definition of affection. He used to be worse. 3 years ago, he'd bite without warning and kick anyone who approached his hindquarters. Now he only threatens. That's progress. Elena studied the gelding with new appreciation. How'd you rehabilitate him? Time, consistency, and accepting that some damage can't be fully undone. You just learned to work around it. Nathan's hand rested easy on the reins, his body moving with the horse's rhythm. A former owner used to beat him. By the time I bought him, he was convinced all humans were threats. Took months to teach him otherwise. But you kept trying. Because giving up on something damaged just because it's difficult is how we end up with a world full of abandoned problems instead of hard-won solutions. The words sat between them like a bridge, like a promise, like the most dangerous kind of hope. Elena focused on the landscape instead of the implications, cataloging terrain and water flow, and the 100 small details that would determine if her idea was brilliant or catastrophic. The eastern fields were worse than she'd thought. The grass struggled, pale and sparse, nothing like the lush growth near the main ranch. Cattle grazed listlessly, too much effort required to move between thin patches. The creek ran through a deep cut, accessible but not conveniently, so requiring cattle to navigate steep banks that older animals and young calves struggled with. How many head do you run here? Elena asked, dismounting to examine the soil. 50. Used to be 80, but I moved some to better pasture when I realized they weren't thriving. The soil's good, not the problem. Elena crouched, ran dirt through her fingers, felt the composition. It's purely water distribution. The creek provides enough flow, but it's not reaching the areas that need it. They spent the next 4 hours mapping the field, Elena sketching rough diagrams, while Nathan took measurements with a surveyor's level he'd brought specifically for this purpose. He'd clearly been thinking about the water problem, longer than he'd admitted yesterday, had more prepared than casual interest would explain. When did you plan this? Elena asked, watching him calculate elevation changes with practiced efficiency. Last night, after you went to bed. Nathan didn't look up from his measurements. You offered a solution to something I've been struggling with for years. I wasn't going to waste time pretending to consider it. I wanted to move forward immediately. What if I'd been wrong? Then we'd have wasted a day walking fields, and I'd have learned something about how you think. Either outcome seemed valuable. Elena returned to her sketching, mapping catchment locations based on elevation, drainage, and grazing patterns. The work absorbed her, demanded her full attention. Let her forget about anxiety and doubt and the constant question of whether this was real or just another elaborate setup for disappointment. By early afternoon, they had a complete map showing 7 potential catchment locations connected by shallow channels that would allow water to flow naturally from higher elevations to lower ones. Nathan studied it with the intensity of someone who understood land, who could visualize how water would move, how cattle would respond, how the entire system would function in practice. This works, he said finally. This absolutely works. It's theoretical until we build it. So we build it. Nathan rolled up the map, carefully tucked it into his saddlebag. I'll get a crew started next week. Should take 3, maybe 4 weeks to complete if the weather holds. Elena's stomach did something complicated. 3 weeks. That's most of our trial period. Oh, so you'll be here to see if your design works. Nathan mounted smoke, waiting while Elena climbed back onto Rosie. And if it does, you'll have proven you're not just valuable, you're essential. Hard to argue with results. They rode back in comfortable silence, Elena's mind already working through the 100 details that could make the system succeed or fail: materials, labor, allocation, maintenance schedules, potential problems, and how to mitigate them. Her brain worked this way naturally, always 3 steps ahead, always anticipating failures before they happen. Her family had called it anxiety. Nathan seemed to recognize it as planning. That evening, but Charles joined them for dinner, a clear boundary dissolution that told Elena Nathan was relaxing formality, treating her less like a guest and more like someone who belonged. Charles brought news from town, updates on neighbors' gossip that was offered with humor instead of malice. Mrs. Chen says to tell you she's baking pies tomorrow, Charles said around a mouthful of Nathan's stew. Apple and cherry. Says you should bring Elena to town, let folks meet her proper. Elena's chest tightened. Town meant scrutiny, meant judgment, meant people forming opinions about her based on rumors her family had probably already started spreading. I don't think we'll go, Nathan said, day after tomorrow. Give Elena a chance to catch her breath, but not so long that rumors develop without facts to balance them. What rumors? Elena asked. Charles and Nathan exchanged a look that suggested they'd already discussed this, had already anticipated the problem. Your father's been writing letters, Charles said carefully, to other ranchers, to the town council, to anyone who'll listen, claiming Nathan's made a terrible mistake, that you're difficult and disobedient, that we should all be warned about your tendency to cause trouble. The words landed like stones, expected, but still painful. So the entire region already knows what a problem I am before I've even met them. They know what your father wants them to think, Nathan corrected, which isn't the same thing, and most folks around here know Robert Mercer's reputation, know he values profit over truth. They'll reserve judgment until they meet you themselves. And if they don't, if they believe him, then they're not worth worrying about. Nathan's voice carried finality. I didn't search for you for 3 years just to let other people's opinions determine whether you stay. But you do deserve the chance to face this on your own terms, not hide from it. So we go to town, you meet people, and we let them see who you actually are instead of who your father claims you are. Elena wanted to argue, wanted to explain that people always believe the worst because it was easier than thinking critically, wanted to protect herself from the inevitable disappointment when an entire town decided she was exactly what her father said. But Nathan's expression held steady confident in a way that made her want to believe him, even though experience had taught her better. Fine, she said, day after tomorrow, but I'm not going to pretend to be someone I'm not just to make them comfortable. Good, Charles said with a grin. We've got enough comfortable people in Pinewood. Could use someone who asks uncomfortable questions. The next day passed in a blur of work. Nathan took Elena through the account books, showing her income and expenses with a transparency that shocked her. Men didn't share financial information with women. That was a fundamental rule her father had enforced absolutely. But Nathan spread the ledgers on the kitchen table and walked her through every entry, explaining his reasoning, asking her opinion on investments and cost-saving measures. You're doing this backward, Elena said, studying the feed purchase schedule. You're buying in small quantities monthly. If you bought in bulk quarterly, you'd save at least 15%, even accounting for storage costs. Nathan leaned over her shoulder, studying the numbers. Storage is the problem. I don't have enough covered space to store 3 months of feed without it molding. So build another barn. A simple pole barn doesn't cost much if you're doing the labor yourself, and you'd recoup the investment in saved feed costs within 2 years. You've thought about this. I've been watching you eat breakfast all week. You buy supplies the same way, small quantities, because you don't plan ahead. It's inefficient. Elena flipped to another page. And you're paying premium prices for veterinary care because you're calling the doctor for every minor injury. Train one of your workers in basic animal medicine. It's not complicated, mostly cleaning wounds and knowing when something's serious enough to warrant professional help. You'd cut your vet bills by 2/3. Nathan pulled out a chair, sat down heavily, like his legs had stopped supporting him. You're telling me I've been hemorrhaging money on feed and vet care for years. I'm telling you that you're good at land management and terrible at supply logistics. Elena softened her tone because his expression suggested she'd just kicked his life's work. But those are learnable skills. And you've been doing this alone since your sister died. It makes sense you focused on what you do best and let other things slide. Sarah used to handle all this, the planning, the purchasing, the logistics. Nathan's voice went quiet. I've been trying to do it her way from memory, but apparently I've been doing it wrong. You've been doing it adequately, but adequate and optimal are different things. Elena closed the ledger carefully. If you want, I can reorganize your purchasing schedule, create templates you can follow, set up contracts with suppliers for bulk deliveries. It's not exciting work, but it's necessary. Nathan looked at her for a long moment, his expression complicated. You've been here 4 days and you've solved my water problem and identified inefficiencies that have been costing me thousands annually. At this rate, by the end of 4 weeks, you're going to have transformed the entire operation. Is that a problem? No, it's terrifying. His smile was crooked honest, because it means I can't afford to let you leave, which puts pressure on this trial period that probably isn't helpful. But I also can't pretend I don't need you here when the evidence is this overwhelming. Elena's heart did something painful. Need and want are different things. They are, but they're not mutually exclusive. Nathan reached across the table, his hand stopping just short of hers, asking permission. I want you here because you're you. I need you here because you see things I've been missing, and you're not afraid to tell me I'm doing things wrong. Both of those things can be true at the same time. She put her hand in his, felt his fingers close around hers, warm and solid and terrifyingly real. I don't know how to trust this. Neither do I. So we'll just keep showing up every day and figuring it out as we go. That night, Elena lay in bed that was starting to feel like hers and tried to catalog everything that had changed in 4 days. She'd mapped a water system, reorganized a purchasing schedule, been treated like her opinions mattered, shared meals with a man who listened when she spoke, and started to believe just barely, just tentatively, that maybe she wasn't fundamentally defective after all. Maybe she'd just been surrounded by people who couldn't handle competence, in a woman who needed her to be less so they could feel like more. The thought was dangerous, hope wrapped in logic, wishes disguised as observation. But it persisted anyway, keeping her awake while the house settled and the wind moved through the pines, and somewhere in the darkness, Nathan probably lay in his own bed thinking similar thoughts, both of them trying to figure out if what was building between them was real or just mutual loneliness mistaking company for connection. Morning came with its roosters and sunlight, but this time Elena woke to a sound she'd never heard before humming from the kitchen, Nathan's voice carrying a tune while he massacred breakfast. She dressed quickly, braided her hair, and found him at the stove burning what looked like pancakes while he hummed something that might have been a song if it had stayed closer to any recognizable melody. "You're cheerful," Elena observed, accepting the coffee that had somehow gotten slightly less terrible over the past few days. "Charles says I've been insufferable all week. Apparently hope makes me annoying." Nathan flipped a pancake that was more charcoal than food. "We're going to town today. Mrs. Chen's pies are ready, and we can't keep hiding out here forever avoiding the inevitable." "I wasn't hiding. I was working." "You were both. But it's time to face the rumors your father's spreading and let people see for themselves that you're not the disaster he's advertising." Nathan slid the burned pancake onto a plate, examined it critically, and tossed it to the dog who'd wandered in from outside. "Also, Mrs. Chen makes much better breakfast than I do, and she's promised to feed us properly if we show up before noon." They rode into Pinewood mid-morning, Elena on Rosie, who'd decided they were friends, now Nathan on Smoke, who was having a good day and only threatened to bite twice. The town was small, maybe 200 people built around a central square where the general store, inn, and church formed a triangle of civilization. Larger than she'd expected for this far west, but still intimate enough that everyone probably knew everyone else's business within an hour of it happening. People noticed them immediately. Conversations paused mid-sentence. Heads turned. Eyes tracked their progress from the edge of town to the hitching post outside Mrs. Chen's inn. Elena felt the weight of their attention like a physical thing pressing on her skin, measuring her against rumors, deciding whether she met or failed expectations. "Breathe," Nathan murmured as they dismounted. "They're curious, not hostile. Big difference." Mrs. Chen exploded from the inn before they reached the door, arms wide, face bright with genuine pleasure. "Finally, I was starting to think you were going to keep this poor girl locked on that ranch forever." She pulled Elena into a hug that smelled like cinnamon and fresh bread, the kind of maternal embrace Elena's own mother had never offered, and something in Elena's chest cracked just slightly, letting light through wounds she'd thought permanently sealed. Come in, come in. I've got pie and coffee that won't poison you, unlike what Nathan's been serving." Mrs. Chen led them inside to a corner table where she'd clearly been waiting, 2 plates already set. "Everyone wants to meet you, but I told them to give you an hour to eat in peace first. My inn, my rules." The pie was perfect. Apple just the right balance of tart and sweet, the crust flaky in a way that spoke to years of practice. Elena ate slowly, savoring it, while Mrs. Chen kept up a running commentary about town news and who was feuding with whom and which rancher's wife had just had twins. Normal gossip, the kind that bound communities together through shared knowledge of each other's lives. Then the door opened, and a man walked in who changed the temperature of the room. He was younger than Nathan, maybe 28, well-dressed in the way that suggested money and care about appearance. His eyes found Elena, immediately studied her with an intensity that made her want to hide. "That's James Harrington," Nathan said quietly. "Owns the ranch north of mine. He's been trying to buy me out for 3 years." James approached their table with the confidence of someone who'd never been told no in a way that stuck. "Nathan, heard you'd brought a bride back from Riverside. Thought I'd welcome her to town properly." His smile was charming, practiced the kind that had probably convinced dozens of people to trust him right before he took advantage. Elena recognized the type her father had used similar smiles when closing deals that screwed everyone except him. "James," Nathan said, his voice carefully neutral. "Elena Mercer, this is James Harrington. He owns Red Creek Ranch." "Miss Mercer," James offered his hand, which Elena took briefly. "Welcome to Pinewood, though I have to say your father's letters made quite an impression. Not often a man writes to the entire territory warning them about his own daughter." The words landed exactly as intended, public humiliation disguised as friendly observation. Elena felt the room's attention sharpen, felt people watching to see how she'd respond, whether she'd confirm her father's claims by getting angry, or whether she'd prove them wrong through composure. She set down her fork, carefully met James's eyes directly. "My father specializes in public relations, particularly when it comes to discrediting people who interfere with his business practices. If he's writing letters about me, I must have done something right." James's smile flickered. That's a bold way to talk about family. That's an honest way to talk about corrupt men who value profit over people. Elena's voice stayed level calm, but she let steel show underneath. Is there something specific you wanted to say, Mr. Harrington? Or did you just come to confirm whether the rumors about my terrible character are accurate? The room had gone very quiet. Mrs. Chen stood behind the counter, arms crossed, expression fierce. Nathan sat perfectly still beside Elena, letting her fight her own battle, trusting her to handle it. James's charming mask slipped slightly, showing calculation underneath. I wanted to warn Nathan that he might have made a mistake. Marrying a woman with a reputation for causing trouble rarely ends well. We're not married, Elena said. We're in a trial period while we determine if we're compatible, which means I'm free to leave anytime I want, and Nathan's free to ask. Seems suspiciously convenient given your attempts to purchase his ranch. That's business. This is personal advice. No, this is you trying to undermine my credibility before I've been here long enough to form my own reputation. Elena stood because sitting felt like submitting, and she'd submitted to bullies enough for one lifetime. So let me be clear. I'm here because Nathan asked me to be. I'm staying because I choose to for now. And whatever my father wrote about me in his letters is his version of events, not objective truth. If you want to know who I actually am, talk to me directly instead of gossiping about letters written by a man who profits from corruption. James's expression hardened. Careful, Miss Mercer. That kind of talk could be considered slander. Slander requires false statements. I'm describing publicly documented facts. If you'd like to dispute them, we can discuss specific examples. Elena held his gaze, refusing to back down. Or you could accept that your attempt to embarrass me in public has failed and go back to your own affairs. For a long moment, James just stared at her, recalculating. Then his charming smile returned brittle and cold. I see why your family had trouble with you. You're not very good at knowing your place. My place is wherever I choose to stand, but I appreciate you clarifying that this is about power rather than genuine concern. Elena sat back down, picked up her fork. Enjoy your day, Mr. Harrington. James left the door, closing behind him with more force than necessary. The room exhaled collectively. Conversations resumed quieter than before, but no longer suspended. Mrs. Chen appeared at their table with fresh coffee and a smile that suggested deep satisfaction. That, she said, was magnificent. Nathan was grinning, unabashed and genuine. I told you people would see who you actually are if you gave them the chance. Elena's hands trembled slightly in her lap, adrenaline burning through her system. She'd just made an enemy, probably cost Nathan a business relationship, definitely confirmed every terrible thing her father had said about her inability to keep quiet. You probably should have punched him, but I appreciate the restraint. Nathan's voice carried pride. James has been spreading rumors about my ranch failing for years, trying to pressure me to sell. He's not a friend, and standing up to him was exactly the right call. But if people think I'm difficult, then they'll be right. You are difficult. Difficult to intimidate, difficult to manipulate, difficult to silence. Those are features, Elena, not bugs. Nathan reached under the table, squeezed her hand briefly, and anyone watching saw that you defended yourself with facts and composure instead of emotion. That's the opposite of what your father claimed. So you just disproved his lies in the most public way possible. Elena let herself believe him just for a moment, just long enough to feel the victory instead of the fear. She'd stood up to a bully and won, had used her words like weapons and walked away unscathed, had proven at least to this room full of strangers that maybe her father's version of her wasn't the only version possible. The rest of their visit passed more easily. People approached their table to introduce themselves, to welcome Elena, officially to offer neutral observations that suggested they were reserving judgment but willing to give her a chance. She met the blacksmith and the general store owner and the school teacher and a dozen other people whose names blurred together, but whose basic decency came through clear. By the time they left, Elena felt exhausted but not defeated, drained but not destroyed. She'd survived public scrutiny and emerged with her dignity intact, which was more than she'd managed in 24 years under her family's roof. They rode back to the ranch in comfortable silence, the afternoon sun warm on their shoulders. Nathan hummed occasionally that same off-key tune from this morning, unbothered by his complete lack of musical talent. Elena let herself relax into Rosie's steady gait, let the rhythm soothe the jagged edges of adrenaline come down. "Thank you," she said as they approached the ranch. "For what?" "For letting me fight my own battle. For not jumping in to defend me or speak for me." Elena kept her eyes on the horizon, afraid to look at him while saying this. "My father always acted like I needed protecting from my own poor judgment. You just let me be myself. That's because your judgment is better than his and you don't need protecting from it." Nathan guided Smoke toward the barn. "I won't lie, watching James try to intimidate you was difficult. Every instinct said to step in, shut him down. But that would have undermined you, suggested you couldn't handle it yourself. And you could, so I didn't." They dismounted, untacked the horses together, worked in synchronized efficiency that spoke to growing familiarity. Elena brushed Rosie's coat until it gleamed, poured feed into the bucket-checked water. Small tasks that grounded her, reminded her that care was just action repeated daily, nothing magical or mysterious. "2 weeks left in our trial period," Nathan said as they walked toward the house. "How are you feeling about it?" Elena stopped on the porch, looking out at the land that was starting to feel familiar. The eastern fields where her water system would soon take shape. The barns where Smoke tried to bite anyone who came too close. The bunkhouse where 15 men who'd been given second chances built new lives one day at a time. The kitchen where terrible coffee and honest conversations happened in an equal measure. "I don't know," she said finally. "I'm waiting for the disaster, for the moment when this all falls apart and I discover it was too good to be true." "That's fair. I'm doing the same thing." Nathan leaned against the porch rail facing her. "Every morning I wake up expecting you to realize you could do better than a rancher who burns pancakes and makes terrible coffee. Every night I'm surprised you're still here. You think I could do better. I think you're extraordinary, and I'm just a man who owns land and tries to treat people fairly. That's not an equal trade." Lelena felt something shift in her chest, some long, frozen part beginning to thaw in ways that felt dangerous and necessary at once. "You see injustice and try to correct it. You hire people others have discarded. You searched for 3 years for someone you saw once. That's not just owning land, Nathan. That's being the kind of person the world needs more of." His expression went soft, vulnerable in a way she'd only seen flashes of before. "Then maybe we're both extraordinary. And maybe that's exactly why this works, because we see the same things and care about them in the same ways." The sun was setting again, painting everything gold. In 2 weeks, the trial period would end. In 2 weeks, they'd have to decide if what was building between them was real or just loneliness and hope creating mirages in the desert. But right now, in this moment, Elena let herself believe that maybe it was real. That maybe she'd found someone who could handle her as she was. That maybe home wasn't a place, but a person who saw you clearly and didn't want you to change. "Come on," Nathan said, pushing away from the rail. "I'll make dinner that's probably edible, and you can tell me more about how I've been running my ranch wrong for years. It's quickly becoming my favorite part of the day." They went inside together, and somewhere in the transition from porch to kitchen, Elena realized she was smiling genuinely. Smiling without performing or pretending or calculating how it would be received. Just smiling because for the first time in her life, being herself didn't feel like a liability. The second week began with shovels and sweat and 15 men who looked at Elena like she might be either brilliant or insane, the verdict still pending. Nathan had gathered his crew at dawn, spread her hand-drawn maps across a makeshift table built from sawhorses and plywood, and explained the catchment system with the confidence of someone who'd already decided it would work. Elena stood at the edge of the group, watching men twice her age study her diagrams, waiting for the dismissal she'd learned to expect. Waiting for someone to say that women didn't understand water systems, didn't understand land management, didn't understand the domestic sphere they'd been assigned since birth. But Charles was nodding, tracing the channel routes with a calloused finger. "Gradient's right. Water'll flow natural, no pumping needed." An older man named Thomas squinted at the elevation markers. "These catchments, how deep?" 4 feet at the center, sloping to 2 at the edges. Elena said, her voice steadier than her hands. "Shallow enough for cattle to drink safely, deep enough to hold water through summer." Thomas grunted, which she was learning was his version of approval. "Clay lining, stone if we can get it. More durable, less maintenance." She stepped closer to the table, pointing to the eastern field's contour lines. The creek overflows here and here during spring melt. We channel that excess into the first catchment, let overflow feed the next one down the line. By June, when the creek runs low, we've got 7 reservoirs holding enough water to sustain 50 head through August. And if we get drought, another worker asked. Miguel, she thought. He'd been polite during introductions, but cautious the way people got when they had been disappointed before. Then we still have more water than the creek alone would provide. The system doesn't solve drought, it mitigates impact. Elena met his eyes directly. It's not perfect, but perfect is the enemy of functional, and functional is what we need. Miguel's wariness shifted into something that might have been respect. When do we start? Nathan looked at Elena, his expression asking permission, even though this was his land, his crew, his decision. She nodded and something warm unfurled in her chest at the gesture at being consulted, being treated like a partner instead of a consultant who'd handed off a plan and should now step back. Today, Nathan said. Thomas, take half the crew to the first catchment site. Miguel, you're with me on the second. Elena, you're overseeing placement. If something looks wrong, speak up immediately. We're building this right or not at all. They worked through the morning heat that rose from the earth like prayer, like punishment, like proof that August in this territory didn't forgive weakness. Elena moved between dig sites, checking depths and angles, and the 100 small details that separated functional infrastructure from expensive holes in the ground. The men accepted her corrections without complaint, without the resentment she'd expected, adjusting their work when she pointed out problems and asking questions when they didn't understand. By noon, sweat plastered her dress to her spine, and dirt caked her hands, and she'd never felt more useful in her life. Nathan found her at the third site where Charles was wrestling with a boulder that refused to be moved. You need water. She did desperately, but admitting weakness felt dangerous. I'm fine. You're dehydrated and pretending otherwise because you think needing basic human care makes you a burden. Nathan handed her a canteen. Drink, that's not a request. Elena drank the water shockingly cold, probably from the spring house. It tasted like minerals and distance and the particular sweetness of water drawn from deep wells. She hadn't realized how thirsty she was until the first swallow hit her throat. Better? Nathan asked when she came up for air. Better. Good, because you're doing amazing work and I need you conscious for it. He gestured toward the dig site where Charles had finally dislodged the boulder with leverage and creative profanity. They respect you. That's rare this fast. Usually takes weeks for the crew to trust new authority. I'm not authority. I'm just someone who drew a map. You're someone who sees solutions and has the courage to voice them. That's authority, whether you claim it or not. Nathan's hand found the small of her back, brief and warm gone, before she could decide how she felt about it. Come on, I brought lunch. They ate in the shade of a cottonwood that stood sentinel over the eastern fields, sandwiches and apples and cheese that had somehow stayed cool in Nathan's saddlebag. The crew scattered to find their own shade voices carrying across the distance, talking about families and horses, and the harvest coming in September. Your sister, Elena said, watching the men. She would have liked this, seeing her ideas built into something real. Nathan went still beside her. What makes you say that? You mentioned she handled logistics, planning, the detail work that makes grand ideas functional. Elena turned the apple in her hands, studying the pattern of red on gold. This is detail work. This is taking a concept and then translating it into measurements and angles and knowing where to place a boulder so water flows correctly. That's what she did, isn't it? She did. Nathan's voice carried old grief refined into something you could touch without bleeding. She used to say that vision without execution was just daydreaming, that the difference between ideas and reality was someone willing to do the math and get their hands dirty. Then she would have approved of this, of using her principles to solve problems she didn't live to see. Nathan looked at her with an intensity that made breathing complicated. You remind me of her sometimes. Not in appearance or voice, but in the way you think, the way you see what's broken and can't rest until you've figured out how to fix it. Elena's throat tightened. Is that why you asked for me? Because I reminded you of someone you lost? No, Theo. His answer came quick, certain. I asked for you because you're you. Sarah's been gone 3 years. I've had time to grieve, time to understand the difference between missing someone and finding someone new. You're not a replacement, Elena. You're not anything except exactly who you are, which happens to be someone I want to know better. The distinction mattered eased something she hadn't known was tense. She'd been a replacement her whole life, the daughter who wasn't what her parents wanted, the sister who wasn't as perfect as Rebecca or Margaret, the woman who wasn't feminine enough, or compliant enough, or simply enough. Being wanted for herself, not as a substitute for something better, felt revolutionary. I want to know you better too, she said, because honesty seemed less dangerous than the alternatives. Which is terrifying because wanting things has historically been a reliable path to disappointment. Same, but we're already this far in. Might as well see where it goes. Nathan stood, offered his hand. Back to work. She took his hand, let him pull her up, and for a moment they stood close enough that she could see the gold flecks in his brown eyes, the sun damage on his skin, the silver threading through his hair at the temples. Close enough that if she leaned forward just slightly, their mouths would meet, and she could find out if kissing him would be the answer to a question she'd been asking since she arrived, or just another complication in a situation already heavy with complications. But Nathan stepped back, releasing her hand with what looked like reluctance, and the moment passed into the category of things that hadn't happened yet, but might given time. They worked until sunset painted the eastern fields in shades of amber and rust, until the heat broke and evening coolness made breathing easier. The first catchment was half complete. The second barely started, but progress showed itself in displaced earth and careful measurements, and the satisfaction that came from building something that would last. That night, Elena soaked her blistered hands in cool water, while Nathan made dinner that was only slightly burned. They'd fallen into a rhythm over the past week. She handled planning and logistics, he handled execution and labor management, and together they built something neither could have managed alone. Partnership, not hierarchy. Collaboration, not submission. James Harrington came by today, Nathan said while they ate. While you were at the third site. Elena's fork paused halfway to her mouth. What did he want? To buy my water rights. Nathan's expression was carefully neutral. Offered twice what they're worth. Said with the drought predictions for next year, smart ranchers are securing water access now. And I told him my water rights aren't for sale at any price. Nathan pushed food around his plate without eating. He didn't take it well. Started making threats about how it would be a shame if something happened to my new water system, if vandals came through before it was finished. The threat hung in the air between them like smoke visible and poisonous. Elena set down her fork with exaggerated care. He's going to sabotage the catchments. He's going to Trinity, which is why I'm posting guards starting tomorrow. Round-the-clock watch until the system's complete and functional. Can't sabotage what you can't access. Nathan met her eyes. I need you to know this is because of the water, not because of you. James has wanted my land for years. The catchment system just gave him a new angle to work. But I designed the system, which makes me the reason it exists, which makes you the reason we'll have water next summer instead of losing cattle to dehydration. There's a difference between being the cause of something and being blamed for it. Nathan reached across the table, his hand stopping just short of hers. James would have found another reason to cause trouble regardless. That's who he is. Don't let him make you think this is your fault. Elena wanted to believe him, wanted to accept that sometimes doing the right thing attracted opposition, not because you'd done something wrong, but because doing right threatened people who profited from wrong. But years of her family's voices lived in her head, insisting that she was the problem, she caused the conflict. If she'd just been different, everything would be fine. I'm not good at separating cause from blame, she said finally. In my family, they were always the same thing. Well, your family was wrong about most things, so maybe they were wrong about that too. Nathan's smile was gentle. You're not responsible for other people's decisions to be destructive. You're only responsible for your own choice to be constructive. And so far, you've been nothing but constructive here. The words settled over her like a blanket, warm and slightly suffocating, because accepting comfort required vulnerability she wasn't sure she could afford. But she nodded anyway, tried to believe him anyway, because the alternative was living in her family's version of reality forever. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of construction and tension. True to Nathan's warning, guards patrolled the catchment sites at night workers who volunteered for double shifts to protect something they'd built with their own hands. James Harrington rode past twice studying the progress with an expression that suggested he was calculating damage potential versus consequence risk. Elena worked alongside the crew during the day, her hands developing new calluses to match the old ones, her skin browning from sun exposure her mother would have found mortifying. She learned the names of every worker's wife and children, learned who was good at mathematics and who was better at physical intuition, learned how to lead by asking questions instead of issuing orders. And at night, she sat on the porch with Nathan, watching the sun set over their work, talking about everything and nothing. About his childhood in Pennsylvania before he came west. About her grandmother's stories of Montana sheep ranches. About books they'd read and places they wanted to see, and the difference between loneliness and solitude. One evening, 2 weeks into construction, Nathan brought out a guitar that looked like it had survived a war. Fair warning, I'm worse at this than I am at singing. That seems impossible, Elena said, because his humming was genuinely painful. Watch. He settled the guitar in his lap, adjusted the tuning with confidence that suggested he at least knew what notes were supposed to sound like, and then proceeded to murder what might have been a folk song. His fingers knew where to go. His voice maintained approximately the right pitch, but something in the combination created noise instead of music. Elena tried not to laugh, failed completely. Nathan stopped mid-verse grinning. Told you. She couldn't find words that wouldn't be cruel. That was very enthusiastic. Sarah used to say I had enthusiasm where talent should be. She was the musician in the family. He ran his fingers down the strings, creating something closer to actual melody. This was hers. I've been trying to learn since she died, figured I could honor her memory by learning what she loved. Turns out you can't force musical ability through sheer determination. You could take lessons. I could, but then I'd be good at it, and being bad at something humanizes me, keeps me humble. Nathan's smile was crooked, self-deprecating. Plus it makes you laugh. That's worth the embarrassment. Elena's chest did something complicated. You're trying to make me laugh. Every day, you don't do it enough. He set the guitar aside, carefully treating it with the reverence of something precious despite his inability to play it properly. You smile now, which is progress. But laughter, genuine, unguarded laughter, I've only heard it a handful of times. I'm collecting them like treasures. The confession landed with more weight than she thought he'd intended. She turned away, looked out at the darkening fields, tried to process the idea that someone was actively trying to make her happy, that her joy was something another person valued enough to work toward. I don't know how to respond to that. You don't have to respond. Just keep laughing when something's funny, and I'll keep being terrible at music. Nathan stood, stretched, his joints popping. Tomorrow, the first catchment should be finished. Miguel thinks we can have water flowing through the channel system by week's end if the weather holds. And if James tries something, then we handle it. Nathan's voice carried steel underneath the calm. Together, because that's what we do now, we handle things together. The first catchment filled on a Thursday morning when the crew diverted a section of creek overflow through the main channel. Water flowed with gravity's patience, following the path Elena had mapped, settling into the stone-lined depression exactly as the mathematics had predicted. By noon, the first reservoir held 3 feet of clear water that reflected the sky like a mirror. Elena stood at the edge, watching cattle approach, cautiously scenting moisture, their thirst overcoming wariness. The first cow dipped her head to drink, and others followed, and within 20 minutes the entire herd had clustered around the catchment, taking advantage of water they didn't have to walk half a mile to access. It works, Nathan said beside her, his voice carrying something that might have been awe. Of course it works. The math was sound. But Elena couldn't keep the satisfaction from her voice, couldn't pretend this wasn't vindication of the most fundamental kind. She'd seen a problem, proposed a solution, executed the plan, and now watched her theory transform into working reality. Charles rode up dusk, trailing behind his horse. Second catchment's filling now, third by evening if the flow holds steady. Good. Nathan's hand found Elena's, threaded their fingers together in broad daylight, where anyone could see, making a statement about partnership and possession that felt both thrilling and terrifying. Let's check the second site. Make sure everything's flowing correctly. They rode out together, Nathan on Smoke Elena, on Rosie, who'd become her horse in every way that mattered except ownership. The second catchment showed similar success, water flowing through channels, with the steady certainty of physics properly applied cattle, already investigating the new water source, the system functioning exactly as designed. By sunset, all 7 catchments were filled, connected by a network of channels that distributed spring overflow throughout the eastern fields. The crew gathered at the main house for a celebration dinner. Beef Nathan had been saving for a special occasion, potatoes from the garden bread Mrs. Chen had sent with explicit instructions about proper celebration requirements. Elena found herself the center of attention in ways that would have paralyzed her a month ago, but now just felt overwhelming in manageable doses. Men thanked her directly, toasted her with water from the new system, talked about how their jobs were more secure now that the ranch could support more cattle year-round. Thomas presented her with a stone he'd carved with her initials pulled from the first catchment, site a physical marker of work done, problem solved, value created. "You're one of us now," he said gruffly, pressing the stone into her palm, "part of the operation. We're grateful." A little warm and impossibly heavy with meaning. Being one of them, being part of something, being valued for what she'd contributed rather than punished for who she was, these were gifts she didn't have words adequate to acknowledge. Nathan found her later on the porch where she'd escaped when the crowd got too dense and her emotions too close to the surface. He sat beside her close enough that their shoulders touched, distant enough to offer escape if she needed it. "You okay?" he asked. "I don't know. I think so." Elena turned the stone over in her hands, feeling the carved letters. "I'm not used to being celebrated. Tolerated sometimes, ignored usually, but celebrated for doing something useful that's new. Get used to it. You just saved this ranch thousands of dollars and possibly my entire operation. Celebration is the minimum appropriate response." Nathan leaned back, looked up at stars beginning to emerge in the deepening blue. "1 week left in our trial period." The words hit like cold water. 1 week. 7 days to decide if what they'd built was real enough to make permanent, if partnership could transform into marriage, if she could trust that this wasn't just a long setup for a punishment she hadn't seen coming yet. "I know," Elena said. "I want you to stay." Nathan's voice was quiet but certain. "Not just because you're useful, though you are. Not just because you've improved the ranch in ways I couldn't have done alone, though you have. But because I wake up every morning glad you're here and I go to bed every night hoping you'll still be here tomorrow. Because you make terrible coffee slightly less terrible through sheer presence. Because you laugh at my awful music and call me out when I'm being stubborn and see problems I miss and care about the same things I care about in the same ways." Elena's breath caught somewhere between her lungs and her throat. "That's not a proposal yet, not technically." Nathan turned to face her, his expression vulnerable in the growing darkness. "But it's a statement of intent. When this week ends, I'm going to ask you to marry me properly. And I need you to know that before the time comes, so you can think about your answer without feeling ambushed by the question. And if I say no, then I'll help you find somewhere else to go, somewhere safe, exactly like I promised. But I'm hoping you'll say yes." His hand found hers, palm to palm, calluses matching. "Not because you think you owe me or because you're afraid to leave or because you can't think of better options, but because you want to build a life here with me as partners in every sense of the word." Elena looked at their joined hands, at the physical evidence of work shared and time invested and the slow accumulation of trust that had happened while she wasn't paying attention. She'd come here expecting disaster, expecting punishment disguised as rescue, expecting to confirm her family's certainty that she was too damaged for anyone to truly want. But Nathan had wanted her anyway, had seen her clearly and chosen her specifically, had offered partnership instead of hierarchy, respect instead of tolerance, celebration instead of criticism, had given her space to be herself without punishment, without constant correction, without the exhausting performance of pretending to be someone she wasn't. "I want to say yes," she whispered, "but I'm terrified that I'm missing something, that there's a trap I haven't seen yet, that this is all going to fall apart the moment I trust it completely." "That's fair. I'm terrified too." Nathan's thumb traced circles on her palm. "I'm terrified you'll realize you could do better. That you'll wake up one day and understand that settling for a rancher who burns breakfast and makes terrible coffee is selling yourself short. But I'm going to ask anyway, because some things are worth risking rejection for. They sat in silence while stars multiplied overhead, while the ranch settled into night rhythms, while 7 catchments held water that would sustain cattle through next summer's heat. Elena thought about her grandmother's words, freedom is freedom, even when it comes wrapped in someone else's malice. Thought about 4 weeks that had transformed from trial period into something she wasn't ready to leave. Thought about the terrifying possibility that maybe she'd found home in a person instead of a place. Ask me again in a week, she said finally. When the trial period's officially over, ask me properly and I'll give you an answer. But you already know what the answer will be. I do. Elena squeezed his hand. But I want to reach the end of the agreement we made before I say it. I want to honor the commitment we both made to give this time to not rush to make sure we were certain. Fair enough. Nathan lifted her hand to his lips, kissed her knuckles with a formality that felt almost like a ceremony. 1 week. Then I ask you answer and we figure out the rest as we go. The next morning brought a letter that changed everything. Elena found it on the kitchen table where Nathan had left it addressed to her in her father's precise handwriting. She stared at it for a long moment, that familiar script triggering responses she'd thought she'd left behind. Anxiety, dread, the anticipation of criticism so carefully wrapped in parental concern that you couldn't defend against it without sounding ungrateful. Nathan emerged from his bedroom, saw her frozen at the table. It arrived yesterday. I almost didn't give it to you. But you did. Because you deserve to make your own choices about your family, even when those choices might hurt you. He moved to the stove, started the coffee ritual that had become morning meditation. You don't have to read it. You don't owe them your attention. Elena picked up the envelope, felt the weight of it. Multiple pages then. Her father had invested time in this, which meant it was important to him, which meant it was probably designed to wound her where she was weakest. I should know what he's saying, especially if he's spreading it to others. She broke the seal, unfolded the pages, and began to read. The letter started with false warmth, asking after her health, hoping she'd found Nathan's hospitality adequate, despite his rough circumstances. Then it shifted to concern. Had she been coerced into staying? Did she feel trapped? The family would understand if she needed rescue from a situation that had become untenable. Elena almost laughed at the irony. Her father framing himself as rescuer when he'd been her jailer for 24 years. But then the letter's true purpose revealed itself in the 3rd paragraph. The family was facing financial difficulties, serious ones. The magistrate scandal she'd exposed 3 years ago had finally caught up with them. Authorities were investigating all the businesses that had benefited from judicial corruption, and the Mercer name was on too many questionable contracts to avoid scrutiny. They needed money. Quickly. Enough to pay lawyers, enough to settle civil suits, enough to keep Robert out of prison. And they needed it from Elena, or more precisely from Nathan. The wealthy rancher who'd married their daughter surely wouldn't want the scandal of in-laws in prison for corruption. Surely he'd be willing to invest in making the problem disappear. The amount mentioned was staggering enough to bankrupt a smaller operation, enough to hobble even Nathan's successful ranch. The letter ended with threats wrapped in concern. If Nathan refused to help, Robert would be forced to reveal certain information about Elena's past to the territorial authorities. Information about her involvement in gathering evidence against the magistrate, evidence that could be reframed as blackmail, as extortion, as criminal conspiracy, if presented with the right spin. He didn't spell out the threat explicitly, but the implication was clear. Pay us or we'll destroy her. Elena read it twice, making sure she understood the full scope of her father's betrayal. Then she set it down carefully, walked to the porch, and threw up in the garden. Nathan was there immediately, his hand on her back, his voice quiet. What did he say? He wants money, a lot of it. And if you don't pay, he'll claim I was involved in criminal activity when I exposed the magistrate. Elena wiped her mouth with the back of her hand, tasting bile and rage and the particular flavor of being used by people who were supposed to love you. He's threatening to destroy me to save himself. Let me see the letter. She retrieved it, watched his face darken as he read, arm into cold calculation. When he finished, he folded it carefully and set it aside like evidence he was preserving for future use. He can't touch you, Nathan said. The authorities know you were a witness, not a conspirator. You provided evidence of corruption, which is protected activity. If he tries to reframe it, he'll just expose his own guilt more thoroughly. But the investigation will be public. The accusations will spread. People will hear his version first, and by the time the truth comes out, I'll already be ruined. Elena's voice came out flat, emotionless, the tone she used when pain was too large to feel all at once. He knows exactly what he's doing. He's weaponizing my conscience against me, so we don't give him the chance. Nathan's jaw was set in a way that suggested he'd already made a decision. We go public first. We release a statement explaining exactly what happened 3 years ago, why you gathered evidence, what you risked to do it. We control the narrative before he can poison it. That will destroy my family. Your family is already destroying themselves. They're just trying to take you down with them. Nathan's hand cupped her face, making her look at him. Elena, you are not responsible for their choices. You exposed corruption because it was the right thing to do. They profited from that corruption and are now facing consequences. Those are separate facts, not causally linked in the way they're pretending. But if I do nothing, if you do nothing, they'll take everything we have and still throw you to the wolves the moment it's convenient. They're not asking for help, they're extorting it. There's a difference. Nathan's voice gentled. I know this is hard. I know they're your family, despite everything. But you need to choose protect them at the cost of everything we've built, or protect yourself and let them face the consequences of their own actions. Elena pulled away, walked to the porch rail, gripped it until her knuckles went white. Her father had calculated this perfectly, had waited until she'd started to trust, started to hope, started to believe she might actually have a future worth protecting. Had waited until the trial period was almost over, until saying yes to Nathan felt possible, and then inserted this poison directly into the foundation they'd been building. If she let Nathan pay, they'd be financially hobbled, and her family would own them forever. There would always be another emergency, another crisis, another demand. If she refused and her father went public with his lies, the scandal would damage Nathan's reputation, cost him business. Relationships, possibly destroy the operation he'd spent 10 years building. Either way, her family won. Either way, she lost. Unless, what if we get ahead of it differently? Elena turned back to face him. What if instead of just releasing a statement, we gather evidence, show exactly what my father's been doing, compile documentation of every corrupt deal, every bribe, every contract that depended on the magistrate looking the other way. Make it impossible for him to claim victimhood because the evidence of his guilt is overwhelming. Nathan's expression shifted, calculating. That would take time and access to records we probably can't get legally. We don't need legal access. We need cooperation from people who've been hurt by my father's business practices. People who kept quiet because they couldn't afford to fight him, but would talk if they had protection. Elena's mind was already working through logistics, through the network of victims she'd encountered 3 years ago, through the web of corruption she'd tried to expose before anyone would listen. My father made enemies, powerful ones. If we can unite them, if we can show a pattern of behavior that makes his current accusations look like the desperate lies they are, we can destroy his credibility before he destroys mine. That's risky. If he figures out what we're doing before we're ready, then he does exactly what he's already threatening to do, and we're no worse off than if we'd done nothing. Elena walked back to him, took both his hands. But if we succeed, we don't just protect ourselves. We protect everyone else he'd hurt in the future. We finish what I started 3 years ago. Nathan studied her face for a long moment. You're sure because once we start this, there's no backing out. We'll be committed to seeing it through no matter what it costs. I'm sure. Elena had never been more certain of anything. My father's been using people's decency against them for decades, expecting that good people won't fight dirty, that moral people will choose peace over justice. But I'm done letting him win because he's willing to be cruel and I'm not. Sometimes stopping bad people requires getting your hands dirty, and mine are already filthy from building water systems. Might as well put them to better use. Nathan's smile was fierce proud. Then we fight, together. They spent the next 3 days in careful, quiet rebellion. Nathan reached out to neighboring ranchers who'd lost land to Robert's schemes. Elena wrote letters to families who'd been ruined by the bridge collapse, people who'd tried to get justice and been shut down by the corrupt magistrate her father had protected. They compiled testimony, documented patterns, built a case that showed decades of systematic corruption rather than, and they did it all while continuing normal ranch operations, while finishing the catchment system, while pretending nothing had changed. Because if Robert suspected they were gathering evidence against him, he'd strike immediately, and they needed time to make their case bulletproof. On the fourth day, Miguel rode in with news that made everything more complicated. James Harrington's in town, talking to the territorial marshal, saying Nathan's been stealing water rights, damming the creek illegally, damaging downstream properties. Elena's stomach dropped. That's a lie. Of course it's a lie, but Harrington's got money and lawyers, and he's claiming damages. Miguel dismounted, his expression grim. Marshall's coming out tomorrow to investigate. If he sides with Harrington, could shut down the whole catchment system. Maybe fine Nathan enough to cripple the operation. Nathan's face showed nothing, but Elena could feel tension radiating from him like heat. Harrington's making his move. He's been waiting for leverage, and now he's got it. Or he thinks he does. Elena's mind raced through possibilities, through the evidence they'd compiled, through the connections between her father's corruption network and James Harrington's business practices. What if they're working together? What if my father gave Harrington information about the water system specifically to create this crisis? Why would they collaborate? Because Harrington wants your land and my father wants money. If they can force you to sell to pay legal fees, Harrington gets the ranch and probably kicks back a percentage to my father for his help. Elena pulled out the map she'd been studying, spread it on the table. Look at the properties Harrington owns. Half of them were acquired from families my father had business dealings with, families who suddenly faced financial troubles and had to sell at bargain prices. Nathan leaned over the map, following her finger as she traced property lines. You're saying this is a pattern? They've been doing this for years. I'm saying we should investigate the possibility, and if we're right, then we're not just fighting two separate battles. We're fighting one coordinated attack, which means we need a coordinated defense. Miguel cleared his throat. What do you need me to do? Elena looked at him, at this man who'd been cautious of her a month ago and was now offering unconditional support. Ride to Pinewood, find Mrs. Chen, ask her to gather anyone who's lost property to James Harrington in the last 5 years. Tell them we're building a case and we need testimony. And me, Nathan asked. You're preparing for the marshal's visit. Gather every document related to the water system, the surveys, the property rights, the engineering plans. Show that everything we did was legal and within your land boundaries. Make it impossible for Harrington's accusations to stick. And I'm writing letters. Elena was already moving toward Nathan's office, toward the desk where correspondents waited. To the territorial governor, to the land office, to every authority figure who might care that there's a pattern of corruption and property theft happening in this region. But we're doing it strategically, with evidence, with support, with enough backing that my father and Harrington can't make us disappear quietly. They worked through the night, building their defense and their offense simultaneously. Nathan compiled documentation proving the catchment system was entirely on his property, using his water rights affecting no downstream users. Because the creek flow was unchanged, they were capturing overflow that would have soaked into the ground anyway. Elena wrote letter after letter, each one carefully worded, to present facts without inflammatory accusations, evidence without emotional appeals. By dawn, they had a defense that should withstand legal scrutiny and an offense that would destroy the credibility of anyone trying to attack them. The marshal arrived mid-morning, a lean man in his 50s, with eyes that suggested he'd seen every variation of human dishonesty and was tired of all of them. James Harrington rode beside him, dressed too well for ranch country, his expression smug in a way that made Elena want to throw something heavy at his face. Marshal Garrett, Nathan greeted him. Welcome to Stone Ranch. Wish it were under better circumstances. Garrett dismounted, declined the water Nathan offered. Got a complaint from Mr. Harrington here claiming you've illegally diverted creek water and damaged his downstream property. Need to investigate before this goes to court. Of course, I'll show you the entire system. Nathan's voice was calm, professional. And I've prepared documentation of property boundaries, water rights, and engineering surveys that demonstrate everything we've done is legal and proper. That won't be necessary, Harrington said quickly, too quickly. The marshal can see with his own eyes what damage has been done. Actually, I prefer to see documentation first. Garrett's tone made it clear he wasn't asking. Saves time when the evidence contradicts the complaint, which in my experience happens more often than not. They spent the next 3 hours going through Nathan's records while Harrington grew progressively more agitated. The surveys showed the catchments were entirely on Stone Ranch property. The water rights documentation proved Nathan had legal claim to the creek flow crossing his land. The engineering plans demonstrated that they were capturing overflow, not diverting the main channel, meaning downstream flow was unaffected. This all looks in order, Garrett said, finally closing the last ledger. Mr. Harrington, can you provide evidence of actual damage to your property? Harrington's jaw worked. The creek running through my land has less water than last year. It's August. Every creek has less water than last year at this time. Garrett stood his patience, clearly exhausted. Unless you have concrete evidence of damage directly caused by Mr. Stone's water management, I'm dismissing this complaint. You can't. I can and am. Garrett turned to Nathan. Your system's legal. Well designed, actually. Wish more ranchers were this thoughtful about water management instead of just sucking creeks dry and blaming drought. Harrington's face went red with fury. This isn't over. It is for me. Take any further complaints to a civil judge if you're convinced you have a case. Garrett mounted his horse, tipped his hat to Elena, who'd been watching from the porch. Ma'am, Mr. Stone, good day. He rode off, leaving Harrington alone in the yard. His scheme collapsed around him. The rancher turned his glare on Elena, hatred stark in his expression. This is your fault, all of it. No, Elena said calmly. This is your fault for assuming you could bully people into giving you what you want. We just refuse to play along. You've made an enemy today. We made an enemy the moment we refused to be victims. Nathan stepped forward, positioning himself slightly in front of Elena. You've lost, Harrington. Accept it and move on. We'll see who's lost when your in-laws' scandal breaks. Harrington's smile was cruel. Word is Robert Mercer's about to be arrested for corruption. His daughter being married to you will tank your reputation right along with his. No one will do business with you once that connection becomes public. Elena felt Nathan tense beside her, but she kept her voice level. Feel free to spread whatever gossip you'd like. We've already sent documentation to the territorial governor explaining exactly what happened 3 years ago, why I gathered evidence against corrupt officials, and how my father profited from the system I tried to expose. By the time his arrest becomes public, the narrative will already be established. I'm the whistleblower who tried to stop corruption, and he's the criminal who's facing consequences. Harrington's certainty flickered. You're bluffing. We sent the letters yesterday, copies to the governor, the land office, the territorial marshal service, and 3 major newspapers. Elena pulled a folded paper from her pocket, handed it to him. Here's a copy of what we sent. Feel free to read it. You'll find your name mentioned several times, particularly regarding properties you acquired from families my father had business dealings with. Interesting pattern there, almost like you've been collaborating for years. Harrington's hands shook as he read, his face going from red to white. This is slander. This is documented fact with testimony from 23 families who've been hurt by your coordinated property theft scheme. Nathan's voice was hard. We spent the last 4 days building an airtight case showing exactly how you and Robert Mercer have been stealing land for the past decade. If you try to hurt us, we release everything we have to the authorities and the press. If you leave us alone, we keep the evidence private and let the investigation proceed without your name prominently featured. Your choice, Ricky. Elena watched Harrington's certainty crumble, watched him realize he'd been outmaneuvered. You're making a mistake. No, we're fighting back. There's a difference. Nathan gestured toward the road. You should leave now and think very carefully about your next move, because we're not bluffing and we're not afraid of you. Harrington left his horse, kicking up dust that hung in the air like a question mark. Elena waited until he was out of sight before her legs gave out, catching herself on the porch rail. The adrenaline that had sustained her through the confrontation drained away, leaving exhaustion and delayed fear. Nathan caught her, held her steady. You were magnificent. I was terrified. Those things aren't mutually exclusive. He guided her to the porch steps, sat beside her while her hands stopped shaking. We did it. We fought back and won. We fought back. We haven't won yet. Elena rested her head on his shoulder, letting herself take comfort from his solid presence. My father's still out there. The investigation's still pending. Harrington might regroup and try again. True, but we're not alone anymore. We've got allies' documentation and a case strong enough that attacking us means exposing themselves. Nathan's arm came around her shoulders, warm and secure. We've changed the equation, Elena. They're playing defense now, not offense. She wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that this victory was real and lasting, not just a temporary reprieve before the next attack. But trust was still expensive, still risky, still felt like setting herself up for disappointment. One more day, Nathan said quietly. Tomorrow our trial period officially ends. Tomorrow I get to ask my question and you get to give your answer. Can we have one day where we're not fighting anyone, where we're just two people figuring out if they want to build a life together? Alona lifted her head, looked at him, at this man who'd searched for her for 3 years, who'd offered her partnership when she'd expected hierarchy, who'd fought beside her instead of protecting her, who'd given her space to be herself without punishment. Yes, tomorrow we get one day, no fighting, no crises, just us figuring out our future. Perfect. Nathan kissed her forehead, gentle and chaste, and full of promise. And for what it's worth, I already know my answer to the question I'm going to ask. I've known it since you mapped the water system. Maybe even before that. Nathan, tomorrow. I'll say it properly tomorrow. He offered his hand. But tonight, let's celebrate surviving today. Mrs. Chen sent another pie. We've earned sugar and victory in equal measure. They ate pie on the porch while sunset painted the mountains gold, while 7 catchments held water that would sustain cattle through next summer's heat, while somewhere in the distance, her father and James Harrington scrambled to defend themselves against consequences they'd spent years avoiding. The pie was cherry-sweet tart and perfect tasting like summer and triumph in the particular satisfaction that came from standing your ground when bullies expected you to fold. Tomorrow, Nathan said, as stars emerged one by one overhead, tomorrow I'm asking you to marry me. Fair warning. Tomorrow I'm going to say yes, Elena replied. Fair warning right back. His hand found hers in the darkness, their fingers interlocking with the ease of practice, of familiarity, of trust, built slowly through shared work and honest conversation, and the daily choice to keep showing up for each other. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, her father's arrest, Harrington's retaliation, the investigation's aftermath. But tonight they could just be two people sitting on a porch holding hands, watching stars multiply overhead, while the ranch settled into peaceful darkness around them. Morning arrived not with roosters, but with silence so complete, Elena woke in panic, certain something terrible had happened during the night. She dressed quickly, her hands fumbling with buttons, and found Nathan already in the kitchen with coffee that smelled almost drinkable. Someone had clearly intervened in his brewing process, probably Charles taking pity on them both. You're up early, Nathan said, not turning from the window where he stood watching the eastern fields catch first light. Couldn't sleep, kept expecting disaster. Elena accepted the coffee he poured, surprised when it tasted decent. Did you do something different with this? Mrs. Chen left instructions. Apparently my technique was a crime against nature, and she couldn't let it continue. Nathan's smile was distracted, his attention clearly elsewhere. Charles rode out to check the catchments at dawn, said everything's holding steady, water level's good, no sign of tampering. That's good. It is. He finally turned to face her, and the vulnerability in his expression made breathing difficult. Elena, I know I said I'd wait until today to ask properly, but I'm not sure I can wait even one more hour. So I'm asking now before breakfast, before we're fully awake, before either of us can overthink this into disaster. He crossed to her, took both her hands, held them like lifelines. Will you marry me? Not because you're grateful, not because you're afraid to leave, not because this is less terrible than your family, but because you want to build a life here with me as my partner, my equal, my wife, in every sense that matters. Because you see the same broken things in the world that I see, and you can't rest until they're fixed. Because you're stubborn and brilliant, and the only person I've met in 33 years who makes me want to be better than I am. Because I love you, Elena Mercer, and I hope you might love me too. The words hung in the morning air, like prayer, like promise, like the most dangerous gift anyone had ever tried to give her. Elena's throat closed around responses, around the yes that wanted to come out, around the fear that saying it made it real and real things could be taken away. I do, she managed finally. Love you. Which is terrifying because I've never loved anyone except my grandmother, and she died knowing it. Everyone else I've tried to love has thrown it back in my face like I'd offered them poison instead of affection. I'm not them. Nathan's thumbs traced circles on her wrist, steady and sure. And I'm not going to throw away the best thing that's ever happened to me just because it came wrapped in circumstances neither of us expected. Even though I'm difficult, even though I see problems everywhere and can't let them go, even though people like Harrington will always use me as a weapon against you because my family's name is toxic. The words tumbled out. All the doubts she'd been collecting for 4 weeks, all the reasons he should change his mind before it was too late. Especially because of those things. Nathan pulled her closer until they stood near enough that she could feel his heartbeat through his shirt. Elena, the world doesn't need more people who ignore problems. It needs people who see them and won't stop until they're solved. That's who you are. That's what I want, not despite your conscience, but because of it. She kissed him, men, before doubt could reassert control, before fear could talk her out of this. His mouth met hers with a tenderness that transformed into something deeper, more urgent, as if 4 weeks of careful distance had created pressure that finally found release. His hands tangled in her hair, pulling it loose from its morning braid. Her fingers gripped his shoulders, holding on while the world tilted and reset around this new center of gravity. When they finally separated, both breathing hard, Nathan rested his forehead against hers. Is that a yes? That's a yes. Elena's voice came out steady despite the chaos in her chest. I'll marry you, Nathan Stone. I'll be your partner and your equal and your wife, and probably a constant source of trouble because I can't help seeing what's broken and trying to fix it. Perfect. That's exactly what I'm hoping for. His smile was radiant, unguarded joy without performance. We'll do it properly this time. Ceremony in Pinewood, Mrs. Chen officiating, if she's willing, everyone who matters present. No hiding, no pretending. This is anything other than what it is, two people who found each other and chose each other and are building something real together. When? Soon. Next week if we can arrange it. Before your father's arrest becomes public and the circus starts. I want one perfect day that belongs to just us before we have to share our story with the rest of the world. Nathan kissed her again, brief and sweet. But first breakfast, because getting engaged is apparently exhausting and I can't think properly on an empty stomach. They were halfway through breakfast, eggs and toast and coffee that maintained its new drinkability when Charles burst through the door with news that shattered their moment of peace. Riders coming, fast. Looks like trouble. Nathan was up immediately, moving to the window. Elena joined him, counted 6 horses approaching at speed, dust trailing behind them like warning. The lead rider wore a territorial marshal's badge that caught sunlight like a mirror. That's Garrett, Nathan said, with deputies. Something's happened. They went to the porch together, Nathan's hand finding Elena's, presenting a united front. Marshal Garrett dismounted before his horse, fully stopped, his face grim, in a way that suggested bad news had gotten worse overnight. Mr. Stone, Miss Mercer. He removed his hat, the gesture carrying weight. Need to speak with you both. Official business. Come inside, Nathan said. Whatever it is, we'll handle it together. Garrett followed them and declined coffee, stood in the middle of the kitchen like a man bearing terrible news he didn't want to deliver. Robert Mercer was arrested last night. Corruption charges, embezzlement, conspiracy to defraud. He's being held pending trial. Oh, Elena felt the words land but couldn't quite process them. Her father arrested. Actually arrested, not just investigated, not just questioned. Consequences finally catching up to decades of corruption. That's good news. Should be. Garrett's expression suggested complications. But he's claiming you were involved, that you helped him embezzle funds, that you were a willing participant in the schemes before you had a falling out and decided to expose him for revenge. He's got documents, he says, prove it, contracts with your signature correspondence that suggest complicity. The room tilted slightly. Elena gripped the table edge, steadying herself. Those are forgeries. I never signed anything related to his business dealings. I believe you, but a judge will need to see proof, and Mercer's lawyers are already building their case. Garrett pulled papers from his jacket. You'll need to appear before the territorial court in Riverside next week. Answer questions, provide testimony. Let them verify your signature against the documents Mercer submitted. It's purely procedural. The prosecutor doesn't believe the accusations, but it has to be done properly. So my father's trying to take me down with him. Elena heard her own voice, flat and distant, recognizing the pattern. He'd always punished her for his failures, always found ways to make his consequences her problem. He's gambling that threatening me will make Nathan pay for his defense, or that I'll recant my testimony to avoid the scandal of a trial. That's my read on it, Garrett agreed. Man's desperate, facing 20 years in prison. He'll use whatever leverage he thinks he has. Nathan's hand tightened on hers. What happens if she doesn't appear? Warrant for her arrest automatically looks like guilt even if she's innocent. Garrett's voice was gentle. I know this isn't fair, Miss Mercer, but the law requires you to answer the accusations formally before they can be dismissed. The prosecutor will move quickly. She's seen this pattern before, father trying to drag daughter down out of spite. But you do have to show up and testify. Elena nodded, processing logistics through the fear. Riverside, her family's town, the place where everyone knew Robert Mercer's version of her, where reputation had been poisoned before she'd left. Walking back into that, facing a courtroom full of people who'd already decided she was guilty, defending herself against accusations her own father crafted specifically to destroy her. We'll both go, Nathan said. She won't face this alone. Good, she'll need support. Garrett put his hat back on, moved toward the door. One more thing. James Harrington's property was raided this morning. Turns out he's been stockpiling weapons, talking about taking justice into his own hands if the law wouldn't give him Stone Ranch. He's being charged with conspiracy to commit terrorism, illegal arms possession, and about 6 other things. He won't be a problem anymore. The news should have brought relief, but just felt like another complication, another thread in a web that kept growing more tangled. Did he mention my father? Extensively. Turns out they've been collaborating for years, just like you suspected. Harrington singing like a bird, trying to reduce his sentence, giving us details about property theft schemes going back a decade. Garrett's smile was grim. So the evidence you compiled, it's supporting testimony in multiple prosecutions now. You did good work, Miss Mercer, even if it's currently causing you significant personal trouble. After Garrett left, Elena sat at the kitchen table while Nathan made fresh coffee and tried to figure out what comfort looked like in this situation. The engagement joy from an hour ago had transformed into something more complicated. Still there, still real, but now mixed with dread and anger and the exhausting knowledge that her father would rather destroy her than face consequences alone. I have to go, she said finally, to Riverside, face the charges, prove he's lying, even though everyone there will want to believe him, because believing me means acknowledging they've been complicit in corruption for years. I know, and I'm coming with you. Nathan set coffee in front of her that she didn't drink. We'll bring documentation. Witnesses, Charles and Thomas and Miguel, they'll testify that you've been here for 4 weeks, that you couldn't possibly have been involved in your father's business. Mrs. Puis Chen will testify about your character. We'll build a case that makes his accusations look like the desperate lies they are. And if it's not enough, if the judge believes him, then we appeal. We fight it through every court level necessary. We don't give up just because the first battle is hard. Nathan crouched beside her chair, his hands covering hers. Elena, I meant what I said this morning. You're not alone anymore. Whatever your father throws at you, we face it together. She wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that partnership meant not having to carry burdens alone, that someone would actually stand beside her when things got difficult instead of stepping back and letting her fall. But trust was still expensive, still required faith she wasn't sure she'd earned the right to have. What if this destroys you? The question came out small, frightened. What if associating with me cost you everything you've built, your reputation, your business, relationships, your standing in the community? My father's counting on that, counting on you deciding I'm not worth the risk and walking away. Then he's going to be disappointed. Nathan's voice was firm, certain. Because I don't make decisions based on cost-benefit analysis when it comes to people I love. I make them based on what's right, and standing beside you is right regardless of what it cost me. Elena felt something break open in her chest, some long frozen part thawing so fast it hurt. She'd spent 24 years being told she wasn't worth defending, wasn't worth the trouble, wasn't worth anything except criticism and correction. And here was someone saying exactly the opposite, saying she was worth defending, regardless of cost, worth standing beside, even when it was hard, worth loving, even though it complicated everything. I don't know how to receive that, she whispered. How to believe it's real and not just something you're saying because you're a good person who feels obligated. Then don't believe it yet. Just watch. Nathan stood, pulled her up with him. Watch me show up every day. Watch me fight for you. Fight beside you, refuse to abandon you, no matter how difficult it gets. Eventually, the evidence will accumulate enough that believing it becomes easier than doubting it. They spent the next 3 days preparing for Riverside. Nathan sent letters to everyone who'd provided testimony about Robert's corruption, asking if they'd be willing to appear in court. 17 said yes immediately. Mrs. Chen wrote out personally to confirm she'd testify about Elena's character, bringing pie and fierce maternal energy that made Elena want to cry and laugh simultaneously. Charles took charge of ranch operations, freeing Nathan to focus entirely on building their defense. Miguel and Thomas compiled their own testimony about Elena's work on the water system documentation, proving she'd been fully engaged in ranch improvement for the entire 4 weeks, with no time or opportunity to participate in embezzlement schemes happening 2 valleys away. The evidence accumulated witness statements, work logs, correspondence, time-stamped and dated, showing exactly where Elena had been and what she'd been doing. By the 3rd day, they had a case strong enough that the prosecutor sent word she expected the charges dismissed immediately once testimony was presented. But they still had to go to Riverside, still had to face her family's town, her father's lies, the public spectacle of a daughter testifying against her father in open court. The night before they left, Elena found Nathan in his office, organizing documents with the focused intensity of someone trying to control chaos through careful categorization. She leaned against the doorframe, watching him work, trying to memorize this moment, him fighting for her before the battle even started, already committed despite knowing how ugly it would get. "Thank you," she said quietly. He looked up, surprised. "For what?" "For this. For preparing like my defense matters as much as yours would. For treating my problem like our problem instead of something I have to handle alone while you stand back and watch." Elena crossed to the desk, looked at the carefully organized evidence. "No one's ever done that for me before." "Then you've been surrounded by the wrong people." Nathan pulled her into his lap, held her close. "This is what partnership looks like, Elena. Your battles are my battles. Your victories are my victories. We don't keep separate ledgers tallying who owes what. We just show up for each other and trust it balances out over time." She rested her head against his shoulder, breathing in the scent of him soap and horse, in the particular smell of sun-warmed skin. "I'm still terrified that we'll get there and everyone will believe him. That I'll stand in that courtroom and realize I'm completely alone despite all this preparation." "You won't be alone. I'll be right there." Nathan's arms tightened around her. "And even if the worst happens, even if somehow the judge believes obvious lies will appeal, we'll fight it through every TV. We'll make so much noise about injustice that the truth becomes impossible to ignore. Because that's what we do. We see what's broken, and we don't stop until it's fixed." They left for Riverside at dawn, riding in a wagon Charles had outfitted for the 2-day journey. Behind them came another wagon carrying Miguel, Thomas, and 3 other workers who'd volunteered to testify. Mrs. Chen followed in her own buggy, determined to witness justice being done properly for once. The road stretched ahead, familiar and foreign at once. Elena had traveled this route 4 weeks ago, leaving her family's house, expecting nothing except continuation of misery in a different location. Now she was returning with a fiancé who loved her friends, who supported her evidence that might finally destroy the corruption she'd spent years fighting against. The irony wasn't lost on her. Her family had sent her away as punishment, and she was coming back strong enough to finish what she'd started 3 years ago. They stopped for the night in Pinewood, where the entire town seemed to know about the trial and had opinions about it. People approached their table at Mrs. Chen's inn, offering support, sharing their own stories of being hurt by Robert Mercer's business practices, promising to spread the truth regardless of what happened in court. "You've got more allies than you realize," Mrs. Chen said while serving dinner to their entire group. "Robert made enemies everywhere he went. The difference is you're giving people permission to speak up, showing them that fighting back is possible. That's powerful." The next morning, they completed the journey to Riverside, arriving mid-afternoon to a town that felt both familiar and hostile. Elena saw people staring as they passed, saw recognition and judgment in equal measure. The Mercer name had power here, reputation built over decades, and she was the daughter who'd betrayed that legacy. They secured rooms at the town's hotel, a respectable establishment that had probably hosted her father dozens of times during business trips. The clerk recognized Elena immediately, his expression souring. "Miss Mercer, or is it Mrs. Stone now?" "It's Miss Mercer for 4 more days," Nathan answered before Elena could. "After that, it'll be Mrs. Stone, but that's none of your concern at present. We need 3 rooms, one for us, one for Mrs. Chen, one for our workers." The clerk's sneer deepened. "We don't usually allow workers in guest rooms. They can stay in the barn." "They're not staying in a barn when they're here to testify in court tomorrow." Nathan's voice dropped to something dangerous. "3 rooms, now, or I'll buy this hotel specifically to fire you, which I can afford to do and would enjoy immensely." The clerk provided 3 rooms. Elena collapsed on the bed in their shared room she'd insisted they share, unwilling to maintain propriety, when her reputation was already destroyed beyond saving, and tried to calm her racing heart. Tomorrow. Tomorrow she'd face her family's town, her father's accusations, the public trial of her character and credibility. Nathan lay beside her, not touching, just present. "You can do this." "I'm not sure I can." "You absolutely can. You've been doing hard things your entire life. This is just one more." He rolled onto his side facing her. "And this time you have got backup. This time when you tell the truth, people will be there to confirm it. This time you're not a lone voice everyone can dismiss. You're part of a chorus, and we're singing loud enough that ignoring us requires deliberate deafness." The trial began at 9 the next morning in a courtroom packed with spectators who'd come to watch Robert Mercer's daughter testify against him, or for him, depending on which version of the story they believed. Elena walked down the center aisle beside Nathan, feeling eyes track her progress, hearing whispers that carried just enough volume to ensure she heard traitor, liar, ungrateful daughter. Her father sat at the defendant's table in expensive clothes. His embezzlement had purchased his expression, carefully crafted to show wounded dignity. He didn't look at her, didn't acknowledge her presence, which was somehow worse than direct confrontation would have been. The prosecutor, a woman in her 40s named Catherine Walsh, who'd built her reputation on taking down corrupt officials, stood as Elena approached the witness box. "Miss Mercer, thank you for appearing today. I know this is difficult." Elena was sworn in, took the seat that put her facing the entire courtroom, tried not to look at her father or her sisters, who sat in the front row wearing matching expressions of vindication. The judge, an older man she didn't recognize, regarded her with neutral interest. "Miss Mercer," Walsh began, "your father has accused you of participating in embezzlement and fraud schemes spanning several years. Can you respond to these accusations?" "They're lies." Elena's voice came out steadier than she felt. "I was never involved in my father's business dealings. In fact, 3 years ago, I gathered evidence of corruption and delivered it to authorities because I believed what he was doing was wrong. And what was the result of that action? The authorities at the time did nothing. The officials involved had connections that protected them. But I had exposed my family's illegal activities, which cost them profitable arrangements. They never forgave me for it." Walsh walked her through the timeline: the magistrate investigation, the bridge collapse that killed Nathan's sister, Elena's attempts to stop corruption that no one wanted to acknowledge. Then she presented the documents Robert had submitted as evidence of Elena's complicity, contracts bearing her signature, letters discussing embezzlement details. "Do you recognize these signatures as yours?" Walsh asked. Elena studied them carefully. "The signatures are forgeries, close but wrong in specific ways. My capital M has a distinct loop my father's forger didn't replicate correctly. And these dates, several of them correspond to periods when I was documented elsewhere, performing tasks that multiple witnesses can confirm. Such as the 4 weeks I spent at Stone Ranch designing and implementing a water management system. I have work logs signed by 15 different workers, correspondence time-stamped by the Postal Service purchases I made in Pinewood with merchants who can verify the dates. I couldn't possibly have been in Riverside signing embezzlement contracts when I was 2 valleys away, building catchment systems. Walsh entered the work logs into evidence, called Nathan to testify about Elena's presence and activities. Then Mrs. Chen, who testified about selling Elena supplies on specific dates that contradicted the forged documents. Then Miguel and Thomas, who walked the judge through the water system construction timeline with engineering detail that made Elena's presence and expertise impossible to dispute. By noon, the prosecution's case was overwhelming. Robert's accusations had been systematically dismantled, exposed as lies built on forged documents and desperation. The judge called a brief recess, returned 20 minutes later, with a decision that showed in his expression before he spoke. Mr. Mercer, the judge said, his voice carrying disappointment and disgust in equal measure. Submitting forged documents to this court is a serious crime. You've not only failed to implicate your daughter in your schemes, you've added perjury and evidence tampering to your existing charges. The accusations against Miss Elena Mercer are dismissed with prejudice. You will face additional charges for this attempt to obstruct justice. Robert's careful dignity cracked. He turned to look at Elena for the first time, his expression carrying hatred so pure it should have hurt. But Elena just looked back, calm and certain, letting him see that his power over her had finally completely ended. Your daughter tried to stop you, the judge continued. She acted with courage and integrity, while you acted with greed and corruption. I hope in whatever time you spend in prison, you reflect on which of you history will judge more favorably. The gavel came down with finality that echoed through the courtroom. Robert was led away in chains, still trying to maintain dignity, still refusing to acknowledge that he'd destroyed himself. Elena's sisters fled before anyone could ask them questions, their faces showing humiliation and fury but not surprise. They'd known the accusations were lies, had probably helped craft them, and were now facing the social consequences of backing the wrong side. Outside the courthouse, Elena stood on the steps in the afternoon sunlight and tried to process what had just happened. Her father convicted, his accusations destroyed, her reputation vindicated in the most public way possible. Justice finally, after 3 years of waiting. Nathan appeared beside her, his hand finding hers. You did it. We did it. Elena squeezed his fingers. I couldn't have done this alone. Would have been dismissed, ignored, destroyed. But together, we were strong enough that they had to listen. Mrs. Chen bustled over, her face bright with satisfaction. That was beautiful, absolutely beautiful. Watching that man's face when he realized he'd lost everything trying to hurt you, worth the 2-day journey. The workers gathered around, offering congratulations and relief. Miguel clasped Elena's shoulder. Proud to work for you, Miss Mercer, both of you. You showed us that fighting back is possible, that corrupt people can be defeated if good people are willing to stand together. They stayed in Riverside one more night, long enough for the story to spread through town, for people who'd believed Robert's version to realize they'd been deceived. Several approached Elena to apologize, to explain they'd been fooled, to ask forgiveness for believing lies about her. She accepted their apologies without warmth or anger. They'd made choices, she'd paid consequences, and forgiveness wasn't required just because truth had finally emerged. The next morning, they left Riverside behind, traveling back toward Pinewood and Stone Ranch and the life waiting to be built. Elena watched the town disappear in the distance and felt nothing except relief. That chapter had closed. A new one was beginning. 3 days later, they stood in Pinewood's small church while Mrs. Chen performed a wedding ceremony that was equal parts traditional and improvised. Elena wore a new dress Nathan had commissioned, simple but beautiful dark green, that complemented her coloring, made with care by a seamstress who'd heard about the trial and wanted to contribute something joyful to the story. Nathan wore his best suit and a smile that hadn't faded since they'd left Riverside victorious. The church was packed, workers from Stone Ranch, townspeople who'd supported them, neighboring ranchers who'd provided testimony against Robert, even Marshall Garrett, who'd ridden 20 miles to witness the wedding. Do you, Nathan Stone, take Elena Mercer to be your lawful wedded wife? Mrs. Chen asked, her voice carrying the weight of someone who understood exactly what this marriage represented. To stand beside her as partner and equal, to build a life together based on mutual respect and shared values, to face whatever challenges come as a united force. I do. Nathan set his eyes on Elena, his voice steady. Absolutely I do. And do you, Elena Mercer, take Nathan Stone to be your lawful wedded husband? To build something new from the ashes of what you left behind? To be brave enough to trust, when trust is difficult, to let yourself be loved by someone who sees you clearly and chooses you anyway? Elena felt tears sting her eyes, felt her voice catch on the words she'd been rehearsing for days. I do. With everything I am, I do. Then by the authority vested in me by the territory of New Mexico and my own conviction that some marriages are clearly meant to be, I declare you husband and wife. Nathan, kiss your bride before I cry all over this ceremony. He did thorough and deep, pulling her close while the church erupted in applause and cheers. When they separated, both grinning like fools, Mrs. Chen was indeed crying, wiping her eyes with a handkerchief she'd brought specifically for this purpose. The celebration afterward was held at Mrs. Chen's Inn, where tables had been pushed together to accommodate everyone who'd fought beside them. Food appeared in quantities that suggested the entire town had been cooking for days. Roasted meats and fresh vegetables and pies and varieties Elena hadn't known existed. People toasted the couple, told stories about the trial, celebrated not just a marriage, but a victory against corruption that had plagued the region for too long. Late in the evening, after the formal celebration had dissolved into smaller conversations, Nathan pulled Elena away to the inn's small garden. They stood under stars that seemed brighter than usual, holding each other in the darkness, letting the noise of the party fade to background music. We did it, Nathan said. Got married, defeated corruption, built a water system that's already improving cattle health. Not a bad month's work. Not bad at all. Elena rested her head against his chest, listening to his heartbeat steady and sure. Thank you for searching for me, for 3 years, for not giving up even when it was difficult. Thank you for being exactly who you are, for being brave enough to expose corruption even when it cost you everything, for being stubborn enough to keep fighting even when no one was listening. Nathan's arms tightened around her. The world needs more people like you, Elena Stone. I'm just grateful I get to be married to one of them. Elena Stone, the name still felt foreign, but also right in ways her birth name never had. She wasn't defined by her family anymore, wasn't trapped by their version of who she should be. She was simply herself, choosing her own path, building her own life with someone who valued her exactly as she was. What happens now? She asked. Now we go home. We work the ranch, we finish the water system, we keep fighting injustice whenever we see it because that's who we are, and we're not going to apologize for it. Nathan pulled back enough to see her face. We build the life we want instead of the life others tried to force on us. We wake up every morning and choose each other again. We prove that sometimes the things that look like punishment are actually the beginning of freedom. They returned to the party long enough to say their goodbyes, to accept final congratulations and offers of support. Then they climbed into the wagon Charles had decorated with ribbons, and flowers started the journey home under stars that watched like witnesses back toward the ranch that had become sanctuary, toward the life they'd built together from determination and hope, and the dangerous belief that maybe happy endings were possible if you fought hard enough for them. The ranch appeared in the distance as dawn broke the 7 catchments, reflecting pink sunrise, light the buildings solid and welcoming against the mountain backdrop. Home, Elena thought. Real home, not the prison she'd escaped, but the place she'd chosen, built by her own hands, alongside someone who saw her clearly and loved her anyway. They dismounted in front of the house that was now legally hers, as much as Nathan's, walked hand in hand through the door, closed it behind them on the old life, and opened windows on the new one. The future stretched ahead, uncertain and full of challenges they'd face together. More corruption to expose, more systems to build, more cattle to raise, probably more enemies to make, because neither of them could see injustice and stay silent. But they'd face it together, as partners, as equals, as proof that sometimes the daughter a family sends away as punishment finds exactly what she needs in the exile, and sometimes the man who searches for 3 years finds something worth all the patience, and sometimes 2 lonely people who see the same broken things in the world discover that seeing clearly together is better than being blind alone. Elena had spent 24 years being told she was too much, too difficult, too broken to be loved. But standing in the kitchen, where terrible coffee had been brewed and honest conversations had happened and partnership had been forged through daily choice, she finally understood the truth her family had never been able to see. She wasn't too much. She was exactly enough. And the right person would recognize that, would celebrate. It would build a life with her instead of trying to diminish her into something more manageable. Nathan came up behind her, wrapped his arms around her waist, rested his chin on her shoulder. "Welcome home, Mrs. Stone." "Welcome home," she echoed, leaning back into his embrace, letting herself trust the permanence of this, the reality of having found somewhere she belonged. "Let's never leave." "Agreed, although we should probably leave occasionally for supplies, and to fight corruption, and to remind the world that good people who refuse to be silent can actually win." Elena laughed, the sound genuine and unguarded, the kind of laughter she'd been collecting like treasures and was now free to spend lavishly. "That's a fair point. Occasional leaving for righteous purposes, but we always come back here." "Always," Nathan agreed. "This is home. Your home. Everything else is just geography." They stood in their kitchen while sunrise completed its transformation of darkness into light, while cattle grazed in fields sustained by water systems built from stubbornness and mathematics, while somewhere far away her father sat in a cell facing consequences he'd spent decades avoiding, while James Harrington learned that intimidation only worked on people afraid enough to submit, while the future spread ahead full of possibility and challenge in equal measure. Justice had never been pretty. It was messy and difficult and required sacrifice from people who could least afford to give it. But sometimes, just sometimes, it actually worked. Sometimes the good people won. Sometimes the corrupt faced consequences. Sometimes a woman who'd been punished for having a conscience found someone who celebrated that conscience, built a life with it, made it the foundation of something beautiful. Elena had been sent away as the ugly daughter, the broken one, the daughter no one wanted. But she discovered something her family would never understand. There was no such thing as an ugly soul. Only ugly choices. And she'd spent 24 years choosing truth over comfort, justice over profit, conscience over convenience. Those choices had cost her everything she'd started with. But they'd also given her everything that mattered. Partnership, purpose, love that didn't demand she be different, and the hard-won knowledge that sometimes the family you choose is infinitely better than the family you were born into. The sun climbed higher, warming the house, promising a day of ordinary work and extraordinary contentment. Nathan released her long enough to start coffee. Still terrible, some things would never change. And Elena moved to the window, looking out at land that was now partly hers, at possibility that stretched as far as vision could reach. She thought about her grandmother, wished Rose could have seen this, could have known that the granddaughter she'd encouraged to choose freedom over comfort had actually found it. Could have met Nathan, could have seen the water system, could have witnessed the trial where truth finally defeated lies. But maybe Rose knew anyway. Maybe the dead watched the living. Maybe love persisted beyond the grave. Maybe all the small kindnesses you showed people echoed forward through time until they reached someone who needed them desperately. Elena hoped so. Hoped that somewhere her grandmother was smiling, satisfied that the girl she'd loved had finally found someone else who could love her back equally well. "Penny for your thoughts," Nathan said, handing her coffee that was predictably terrible. "Just thinking about my grandmother. Wishing she could have seen this. Maybe she can." Nathan settled beside her at the window, their shoulders touching. "Maybe all the people who believed in us when no one else did are watching, now satisfied that their faith was justified. Maybe that's what legacy is, the continuing effects of love, even after the person who gave it is gone." Elena sipped her awful coffee, tasted bitterness and hope in equal measure, and let herself believe in ghosts, just enough to say goodbye properly. "Thank you, Grandma, for teaching me that strength wasn't weakness, for showing me that conscience was worth keeping even when it cost everything, for loving me exactly as I was so that I'd recognize when someone else did it too." The words drifted into the morning air, carried by wind that moved through pines, scattered by sunlight that touched everything equally, the just and unjust, the good and corrupt, those who chose truth and those who chose comfort. The world kept turning indifferent to individual triumphs and tragedies, continuing its rotation regardless of who won or lost their small battles for meaning. But on this particular piece of land, in this particular house, two particular people had won something worth keeping. They'd found each other through circumstance and choice, through his 3-year search and her willingness to trust when trust was dangerous, through daily decisions, to keep showing up even when showing up was hard. They'd proven that corrupt families could be escaped, that justice could occasionally win, that love, based on shared values and mutual respect, was stronger than love based on convenience or appearance. They'd built something real from materials no one else wanted, a woman considered defective, a man considered too idealistic, principles that prioritize people over profit. And somehow, against all reasonable expectations, it had worked. The morning stretched ahead with its ordinary demands, cattle to check workers, to coordinate systems, to maintain the endless rhythms of ranch life that didn't pause for weddings or trials or personal epiphanies. But Elena faced it with something she'd never had before, the certainty that she wasn't facing it alone. That partnership meant shared burdens and shared joys, that some battles were worth fighting precisely because someone else was willing to fight beside you. Nathan finished his coffee, grimaced at the taste he'd somehow never learned to improve. Ready to start our life together, fair warning. It's going to involve a lot of work, occasional crisis, and coffee that ranges from terrible to catastrophic, depending on whether Mrs. Chen intervenes. Ready, Elena said, and meant it with every part of herself. Let's build something beautiful. Let's prove that good people who refuse to be silent can actually change things. Let's wake up every morning and choose each other and justice and truth even when they're difficult. Let's be living proof that sometimes the best revenge is building a life so good that those who tried to destroy you become irrelevant. Nathan grinned, fierce and proud and full of love that didn't require her to be anything except herself. That's exactly the plan. They walked out together into morning light, into the work waiting to be done, into the future they'd chosen instead of the one that had been chosen for them. Behind them, the house stood solid and welcoming. Ahead, the ranch stretched toward mountains that marked horizons they'd reached together. And everywhere in the water systems, built from stubbornness, in the cattle, thriving because someone cared enough to solve problems, in the workers given second chances, in the marriage forged from honesty instead of convenience, everywhere was evidence that sometimes doing the right thing, though costly, was also redemptive. The world didn't need more perfect people. It needed more people willing to try, fighting for justice, even when justice was difficult and expensive and often thankless. Elena and Nathan had found each other because they were both exactly that kind of person. Stubborn, principled, unable to see suffering without trying to alleviate it. And together they were building proof that such people could not only survive but thrive, could build lives worth living, could love deeply and work hard and change small corners of the world through determination and daily choice. And the refusal to accept that corruption was simply how things were. Years later, the story would be told differently by different people. Her family would claim she'd abandoned them cruelly. His neighbors would say he'd been lucky to find her. Mrs. Chen would insist she'd seen the match from the beginning. The workers would remember her water system and his willingness to give second chances with equal gratitude. But the truth, as always, was more complicated and more simple than any single version could capture. Two people had found each other through circumstance and choice. They'd built something real from determination and hope. They'd proven that sometimes the daughter sent away as punishment finds freedom in exile, and sometimes the man who searches for years finds exactly what he's been missing. And sometimes love based on shared values is stronger than love based on anything else. And they lived the rest of their lives trying to be worthy of that gift, trying to see clearly, fight justly, love deeply, and leave the world marginally better than they'd found it. Not because they were special, but because they'd learned that ordinary people making ethical choices accumulated into something that resembled justice if you gave it enough time, and refused to surrender when the cost got high. The sun rose higher, work called, life continued. And in a small house on a New Mexico ranch, two people who'd been lonely separately discovered what it meant to be complete together, proving that sometimes the best stories start with cruelty and end with grace, and that the distance between those 2 points is measured not in miles but in choices in the daily decision to be better. Do better, love better, until better becomes simply who you are.